Comic Geek Speak presents The Crisis Tapes, Episode 15, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Issue Number 3, Part 2.
I'm Adam Murdo.
I'm Peter Rios.
And welcome back to the Crisis Tapes. Picking up where we left off just a few short weeks ago, talking about the third issue of the Maxis series. That is the subject of this spin-off podcast of ours. Ready for some more Crisis talk, Peter?
I am so ready. You can tell that we're really we sort of groove when we're in the middle of something, like when we have to do a part two, we sort of get to that episode quicker.
Right. We don't want to lose the heat that we, resume the tempo that we established the first time.
Yeah,
Don't want to lose our respective trains of thought. But yeah, so you don't have to wait quite so long for your Crisis fix this time around.
Which is great. And why don't we just kick right off with some feedback from the last episode, because we got a few things here and there on the forum, on Twitter, and elsewhere. So you want to jump in right away?
Oh, sure. A couple of listeners jumped in to answer your question about the expression "Great Scott," associated with Earth 2 Superman. So Jamie Dunst gave us a link to a Wikipedia article, and Kane, Q-A-Y-N-E, linked us to a Freakonomics blog post, which suggests that it may come from the Civil War. Members of certain Virginian regiments used to swear by old fuss and feathers. General Winfield Scott. Hence, Great Scott. So there's one possible etymology for that.
Right. Very cool.
Our friend Ian Levenstein sympathizes with your overanalyzing older comics and linking everything up to the emotional spectrum, Peter.
Love it. There will be more. Maybe not in this episode, but there will be more later.
I do not doubt it. And something else Ian mentioned. He linked us into a story on CBR about how Roy Thomas and Marv Wolfman were both lobbying to change the name of the company of DC Comics in the wake of the Crisis.
Yeah, and this is something I remember bringing up before, but I can't remember if it was on a Crisis Tapes or on one of the few CGS episodes that I popped in on, last year or whenever. But I remember talking about, what is DC Comics these days? This was in regards to the movie universe more, When you see the Marvel logo, Marvel means something. It's a word, so it means something, but it also is a comic company. And I remember saying, well, what is DC, right? Like, we know what it is, and there are even people who don't read comics that they don't necessarily describe the universe. They'll say it as, Marvel, but then they say, well, is the other one where Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman is? You know what I mean? They don't say DC necessarily.
Right, the brand's not quite as widely known, but it's getting there.
Yeah, but I actually like the action title. I mean, it's revolutionary. It would be a fundamental, earth-shattering crisis event to change the name of DC Comics.
Right, at this very late date in history.
Yeah, but imagine it would, you almost think if it was going to happen, it would have had to have happened when they did the 52 reboot, when it's a total, almost across the whole board switcheroo of company and vision and they dropped the whole digital thing back there. Like the whole company itself rebranded itself under the DC Entertainment. So you could have said, all right, we're going to now create this thing called DC Entertainment, and our comics are going to be called Dynamic Comics, which is what Roy Thomas suggested, or Action Comics. Now, the only thing about this Comic Book Resources article, they give a resource for Roy Thomas, but there's no resource of where Marv Wolfman, unless but there's no, I haven't been able to find a resource that says this is where Marv Wolfman made that suggestion. I would love to see that.
Yep, I'm afraid I can't provide it for you, Peter. So
Yeah.
it's just kind of anecdotal at this point.
Right. It's always good to have a source, right? So, and a website article is not enough for me. I want to see it in a magazine. I want to see it in one of Marv Wolfman's. And of course, when you try to look up Marv Wolfman Action Comics, you get all kinds of comic book references.
Right, that
of
run he did
Action
with Gil
Comics.
Kane that you enjoy so much.
Yeah. So it's like you can't. It's hard to find something, but. I don't know. I think it's something revolutionary and something kind of crazy, but there's still a part of me that kind of agrees with it. That it would just be interesting, but so it's kind of nice to see that there's actual historical context for it.
And then Ian punctuates his point by. He says, so if they had changed the name to reflect Action Comics like Wolfman suggested, would everything be AC Comics? I know one person who would have loved this. And then he includes a gif of a clip from an old episode of Saved by the Bell with AC Slater doing a ballet routine around the teen hangout. Funniest thing about that is it's apparently this was taken from a rerun aired on TBS, and apparently TBS thought a rerun of Saved by the Bell qualifies as educational or instructional because the little EI logo's in the corner.
That's funny.
Yeah, that is. Let's see. Longest post relating to our last episode, number 14, that comes from DM Hate. He tells us, thanks for another great episode. A few random comments to add. On the Supergirl Flash team-up, as we mentioned that in our last episode, the episode of Supergirl on CBS featuring the Flash from the Flash TV show, Grant Gustin. It's very telling to see two characters who were basically jettisoned in 1985 are now in 2016 not only back, but headliners of their own TV series. This also reminds me of an article that CBR posted back in September of 2015, and he links us to this really neat sort of composite mosaic image that somebody put together of what it would look like if all the different TV and film interpretations of DC characters had their own sort of crisis crossover where they all were united against a common foe that threatened their respective realities. So you get everybody from the Adam West Batman to, well, the live-action Swamp Thing movie to the Smallville, Tom Welling and his superhero pals, and just theorizing what that kind of crisis team-up would be like. It's kind of a cool image. DM Hate continues, as for my own Crisis Kid story, another one of these Crisis Kid confessionals, I started collecting comics in 1976 with primarily Marvels, but eventually started getting into the Justice League of America title, and then branched out to a few others, including the New Teen Titans and All-Star Squadron. The annual JLA-JSA team-ups were something special, and in spite of whether the individual storylines in the JLA title were all that good, from 1977 through 85, I made the effort to search out the annual team-up stories. Crisis seemed like it was taking that core concept to the next level by having a multiversal crisis that impacted the entire suite of DC characters, and I found that fascinating. In fact, I recall very clearly feeling at the time that this was the best comic book series I'd ever read, even better than the Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars, which was still going on at the time. With the passage of time, I can see more clearly the flaws of both stories, but I still hold COIE as among my favorite stories coming in in comics 30-plus years later. Upon reflection, I've come to understand that my love for the series is less about the supposed need to clean up the DCU, because frankly, I never found it too difficult to understand. It was more about, A, the idea I mentioned about this being like the ultimate expansion of a JLA-JSA team-up, right on there. B, it was being done by the team of Marv Wolfman and George Perez, and by that point I was just starting to recognize individual contributors to the stories and how some were better, some were worse. And C, it highlighted the parallel Earths concept, which I also have an affinity for, and am glad to see back in the modern-day DCU in spite of how it came back. I.e., my feelings about Infinite Crisis aren't quite as positive as with Crisis, but that's more of a tangent for another time. Perhaps if after you, meaning the two of us, cover the main Crisis series proper, you find it appropriate to cover some of the offshoots that came later. And we'll certainly take that under advisement. But that's years in the future. I liked your noting of how this series acted in a sense as a peek into the future of the DC characters, especially with The Flash in issue number 3. I can't think of another event crossover series that's taken this approach since Crisis. Marvel's 1984 Secret Wars took a different approach by basically flashing their characters forward to after the event and then filling in the story of how the changes we saw took place, i.e. how Spider-Man got his new costume, how She-Hulk joined the Fantastic Four, etc. I liked Crisis's storytelling method better. It keeps the suspense higher, in my opinion. One other comment on the topics you guys discussed in the issue. Since I prefer an in-story explanation over the idea of Sergeant... Okay, so this is referring to one of the very last things we talked about before we took a break in the middle of the issue. It's the scene where Sergeant Rock sees Geoforce and his companions, Dr. Polaris and so forth, and calls them mystery men like you all-stars. Since I prefer an in-story explanation over the idea of Sergeant Rock making the all-star reference based on reading the comic book series, which was my stab at a no prize, here's a feeble attempt to no prize his comment. Could it be an early example of the time-space dilations that occur more intensely in later issues? So while the Earth they're on is clearly Earth 1, perhaps Sergeant Rock and Easy Company were either the Earth 2 versions of those characters. I know you mentioned on the podcast that you didn't think there was an Earth 2 Markovia, but it's never been explicitly stated that there isn't one. Or what if they were the Earth B versions, the ones specifically from the early Brave and the Bold minis where Sergeant Rock teamed up with Batman, Wildcat, and others? Anyway, thanks for another 3 hours of fun. Looking forward to issue 3, part 2 and beyond. Well, how's that sound to you, Peter?
Sure. I sort of always take it, if we don't hear that Earth 1 counterparts have Earth 2 counterparts or vice versa, the norm, the average, usually means that there are no counterparts, right?
That's the assumption I usually make too, yeah.
Yeah. I do like the Earth B concept. He was even in DC Comics Presents around this time.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I think the easier answer is probably the comic books, and that's actually somewhat more in that has a precedence because, if you think of Barry Allen Flash's first story, he's reading. Oh wait, yeah, he mentions comics, and I think is he actually reading an All Flash issue? I can't remember.
I think I do remember that he's reading an old Jay Garrick comic.
Yeah. So, either way, more to the point of the Sergeant Rock saying All Star. I think our larger point was there are some, website, what do they call them? Not anthologies. What do they call them? The name completely escapes my mind. Where they annotations. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. The Annotated Crisis from John.
I'm not drinking either. So
yet.
I think our larger point was they were using that as evidence that this was Earth 2, and that's clearly not the case. So I think that's more why we wanted to make sure that even though he says All-Star Mystery Men, that is not evidence that section takes place on Earth 2. There's too many other things that make it Earth 1. Right.
Although the Earth B idea is kind of, it's neat. The continuity wonk in me would kind of like to see Earth B represented in the story.
Right.
Even if it does get trashed right afterwards.
Cool.
Okay, then we've got something here from our old friend Chris Gallo, who goes by Webhead on the forums. He says he was never aware that there was a Losers special, commenting on the death of the Losers, the old World War II characters who perished. That was the very last thing we mentioned when we cut off at the end of the last episode. Chris says, when I was a kid, I had only one friend who was into comics, and he mostly read war comics. So we would go over to each other's houses and read comics. He would read my horror comics. That's a side of Chris I didn't know was there. And I read mostly the stories with the Losers of his comics. The send-off the Losers got in Crisis was a sad moment that has stuck with me, and now I find out there is more to that story. I've got to read that. Yep, definitely recommended, Chris. I mentioned it in the last show, but it's one of the few comics that actually made me cry. So there's buckets of pathos in the Losers special. And here's something from our friend Eddie over in Australia. He goes by Deadpool on the forums. And he writes, so still reading along, but not breaking my reading into two parts, taking me long enough to read through this trade. I was thinking about Crisis and New 52 this week. Will we one day have Flashpoint Kids? Or was Crisis different? I'm sure people were annoyed by Crisis rebooting things back then, but were people feeling the same way about DC Comics then as they are today about New 52? Obviously, content differs, but for me, Crisis seemed to still carry the universe forward, i.e. Wally West becoming Flash, and while things changed in the history of characters, it still felt like we were getting the same characters after Crisis, but with New 52, we seem to have gotten a brand new universe entirely. So that's a good question, Eddie poses there. Are we one day going to have people who think back on Flashpoint with the same fondness that your generation, Peter, thinks back on Crisis?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm sure, maybe. I think when I think we get sometimes comic fans get far too centric, far too selfish when they think that their experience is universal or should be universal. And one of the things where it comes out the most is when I hear people say, "Oh my God, they're going to do another origin story movie. We just had one 8 years ago." And I sort of want to say to them, well, in 8 years, a kid could go from being 2 to 10, and maybe they didn't see the first, you know what I mean? So
exactly, yes.
You just never really know. Now, I don't know. I mean, that would mean that somebody would have had to have started reading DC, prior to 2011 when the reboot happened.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe around 2009, 2010. And then when Flashpoint hit, they're like, "Oh my God, my universe is going. What's coming in?" And then, love it or hate the New 52, there certainly was a very strong buzz and hype around the releases of all those first issues. So, if anything, if they are a Flashpoint kid, which is funny, they're getting a DC universe that we didn't get. We didn't get all new number one issues. We got a lot of them, but so it's almost like, damn, I wonder what it would have been like to just have 2 or 3 years of reading under my belt, to be around 13, 14, 15 years old, and sort of be affected by what they're going to change. What, I don't know. That's kind of cool. It's kind of cool to think. I can't imagine. It's probably as much as with Crisis, because nowadays we're so inundated with hype and everybody's opinions of 2 sound bites of information, So I think it's a little different these days.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is that. We're all kind of desensitized to these upheavals. They're it's just part of the game that's played by the publishers these days.
Yeah.
It's quite the shock that Crisis did 30 years ago.
Not only comics, but everywhere. Everything's getting a reboot, a revamp, a relaunch, a redesign. X-Files and Ghostbusters and Power Rangers and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, everything. Transformers. Everything's just anything that you grew up with is coming back in some form, way, shape, or form. Even Doctor Who. I mean, the success of Doctor Who these past whatever years is a revamp.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Regeneration, if you will, in the Doctor.
Well,
case.
There you go. Yeah.
But yeah, there is all of that, and then even more basic than that for me is just the simple fact that I don't think there are as many kids, period, reading comics these days. So
sure,
it makes it that much harder for there to be Flashpoint kids.
Yeah.
So
it'll be interesting to see if there's a Flashpoint tapes that somebody does in another 10 years or so.
Yeah, I wonder what they'd choose to call it. What's the Flashpoint MP3s? What's going to be the soon-to-be obsolete recording medium that they'll use?
Yeah.
Yeah. And one more thing from the comments then. Our friend down south, John Morrissey, the Marvel Man. At long last, another installment of this fascinating series. I'm another one of those Crisis Tapes kids who is reading along with these CGS episodes, and I am enjoying myself immensely. The best part? It's not when Adam or Peter point out something in the story or art that I missed completely. That happens all the time. The best part is when each of these experts points out something that the other guy has missed. If that's not evidence that this series is infinitely rich, then I don't know what is. Amen, John.
Very true.
Yeah.
I do want to point out James Bolt on the forum thread. He wrote, he says, thanks that you're back. These recordings are loved deeply. Keep up the great works. He only has one post, and his one post was in this thread. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks for making it count.
Yeah, and it was cool to hear from Webhead, from Chris. That was awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I still carry the keychain he gave us for, I think it was episode 300. I still have it on my keychain in my pocket.
Yeah, I have that, and I have the one, he gave us one out in San Diego, too. I have a Spider-Man and a Superman one from him. Still on my keychain as well. Yeah.
Yep, every last bit of paint has been worn off of it, but I still have it on there. It's got my name etched into it, and CGS 300, September 22nd, 2007.
I have one more. This was from Twitter. And this was from, he goes by Philossopop on Twitter. And I'm pretty sure it came through the CGS Twitter. And he said, what he did was he took a picture from issue number 3, page 10 of Brainiac's head. Dome, the robot Brainiac, the silver robotic form where his brain is sort of like a dome shape with geometric shapes and all kind of colors. So he took a picture of that, and then he said, look, this image proves that Brainiac's head, if you look at that and then you think of all the domes in Convergence,
mm-hmm.
He says that proves that Brainiac's head is DC's Saint Elsewhere Tommy Westfall's snow globe. So in essence, he's saying all of this is happening inside Brainiac's Convergence was just happening inside Brainiac's head. Which is kind of funny.
Brilliant there. And if only I had watched more Saint Elsewhere, I might have completely appreciated the reference. But I'm sure it's brilliant.
Do you know? Oh, so you don't know the reference?
No, I don't. I really never watched Saint Elsewhere.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's sort of, it's not a huge spoiler, but I'm pretty sure the last episode, Tommy was a kid who was sort of like a special needs kid, and I believe, I might be quoting that out of context, but he was in the hospital, and apparently he grabs a snow globe, and the whole idea is that the entire Saint Elsewhere TV show was just sort of like in his imagination. It was very much kind of like a Franklin Richards Heroes Reborn, universe in a ball kind of thing.
Ball, right.
Yeah.
Huh, neat.
Which I would have to see to make sure I'm even saying it's right. But it was something like that, because I remember watching it because Howie Mandel was on the show, and I used to watch that show. So,
Yeah, I think I was a little bit too young.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still, good catch, Philossopop, there, on noticing that those hex cells that compose the domes of the different stolen alternate reality cities in Convergence sort of mimic the appearance of a new Brainiac from Pre-Crisis's cranium.
Yeah.
That is a good catch.
Yeah. Two more things. One of them is real quick. So we really love all these Crisis Kid stories. Love all that. And apparently now we have Crisis Tapes Kids stories, which is also fun.
Indeed.
Adam and I try whenever we can to include Crisis Fun Facts. And I do have one for this episode that we can just save for the end, because it doesn't necessarily relate to anything in this issue or anything that we're talking about right now. And someone suggested, I think it's Jack Sir. I think. And I think we might have played with this in one of the earlier episodes. He liked the idea, or maybe I wrote this down, of untold Crisis tales that we would like to see based on the issues that we comment on. And I think we did something like that early on in the first issue, where we said, how did the crime syndicate escape from their prison to then, battle the Crisis in issue 1? Or did Alexander Luthor free them? Or, remember we talked something like about that?
Uh-huh.
That could be an interesting story. So I thought that was kind of fun, like to keep in the back of our minds. It doesn't have to be always, but, oh, look, this is a perfect opportunity for an untold Crisis tale.
Yeah, we could put together a fan fiction anthology.
Oh, my God, sure.
That would be fun. Crisis Quarterly, we could call it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there. And like I said, we'll do the fun fact. I'll do my fun fact at the end.
Okay. Yeah, I already know what story I would contribute there. I've had something in the back of my head about how Brother Power the Geek would weather the last days of the old DC universe.
Oh, interesting.
Yep, I'm going to keep it to myself, though. I'll tell you about it at Wild Pig.
Okay, sounds good.
And one more thing for me here, too, though, relating to crisis in contemporary comics news. Mm-hmm. Pants told me a little while ago that you teased him with a theory you had about the cover of the upcoming DC Rebirth 80-page special. Kicking off yet another undoubtedly crisis, reality unraveling related. Events, just revealing new truths about the hidden infrastructure of reality in the DC universe, supposedly. And the cover of that issue has a mysterious hand reaching out of this gaping white void on the cover of that issue, reaching out towards the new 52 versions of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, et al. And so Pants asked me a while ago who I thought that hand might be. My first guess is just that it's yet another iteration of the Monitor.
Really? The Monitor?
Yeah, which it does seem a little bit obvious in hindsight, but it made sense to me that it would be some kind of quasi-divine being reaching out of the ether like that. I have a second guess in mind, and Pants told me that you had an idea, and I would like you to share your theory now with all of the Crisis Tapes listeners.
Okay. Mine is less a theory, more just random speculation or, unsupported wish fulfillment, maybe. My biggest one, the one that I want it to be, but I'm not sure it will be, only based on who else is on the cover. But my absolute wish fulfillment would be that it would be the pre-crisis Superman.
Oh, the Earth 1 Superman.
Yes.
Oh, that would be outstanding. We've been wondering for ages what became of him.
Exactly. I mean, we talked about it in Crisis Tapes a lot, about how, when the Crisis ended, there was this weird little period between the ending of Crisis and the beginning of John Byrne's Superman, where, if you want to call him the Earth 1 Superman, not the one that all the way back from Action Comics #1, but the one that is associated with the Silver Age and Kurt Swan and Neil Adams and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez and Cary Bates, and the one that has Crypto as his pet, and Jor-El with the headband and the sun on his chest,
yep,
and
the
all guy
that. He had his swan song in the Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow story.
Exactly. Perfect. That's great. That's a great way to encapsulate him. We've never seen him again. Anytime that we've sort of touched on these big crisis events, they would always go back to the Byrne Superman, but not necessarily the Earth 1 Superman. Now maybe in Infinite Crisis we might have seen his rocket ship, but I can't remember. So they've always only ever gone back to John Byrne Superman. So I thought, if they're talking about legacy and all that kind of stuff, wouldn't it be awesome for that to be him? That's my sort of wish fulfillment one. But if I look at the image itself, it does feel like it's a gloved hand.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself.
Yeah. And if you listen to Morrison and you listen to Jeff Johns and all these writers, you can't have a crisis event without a Flash. So my other choice would be, and I wonder if you're thinking the same thing, would it be Kid Flash, the Wally West ginger-haired New Teen Titans Kid Flash? Now, I can't imagine, I don't know why it would be him, but he's sort of the missing link between the pre-Flashpoint and post-Flashpoint. Now, there is a Wally West, but in terms of the character itself, the one that,
Yep, he's very visibly different from the Wally West that we'd had in earlier versions of the continuity.
Right. Is that the link? Is that the thing that is... Because if you look at this image, it almost seems like the lightning striking these characters is doing away with the 52, especially on Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. Because the Supergirl is still the Supergirl of New 52 behind, but some of the characters are going to be in the later DC Rebirth universe. So it's confusing, right? You don't know quite what the Image is doing. So that's my other guess.
And you know what, Peter? You were right. That was my second guess.
Oh, listen to that. Okay.
I think it's also Ian Levinstein's first guess. As I think I did. Somebody who listens to us had come to the same conclusion. Mm-hmm. I think it was Ian. But yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think you've kind of answered your own question there, Peter, as to why it would be Wally. I mean, he's Flash equals disastrous continuity revisionism in the DC universe. You can't do a crisis without some kind of Flash involvement. And as you also said, he's a critical link of chain lightning, if you will, to an earlier version of the reality. And we've seen that Flashes can kind of skip between realities at will as a result of their vibrational powers. And we've got a version of Wally in this new reality, but he is drastically different from the earlier version. So we can have kind of an Earth 1, Earth 2 situation with those two characters here. And
right.
I don't really see him being the guy who sits up in his watchtower someplace or in that little hole in the wall in this little pocket universe in reality, like Earth 2 Superman, Alex Luthor, Superboy Prime, and Lois Lane of Earth 2 did prior to Infinite Crisis, passing judgment on the reality that's come into being, and saying to himself, "There's something. I love this world, but there's something missing." And pondering what he can do to fix things. That way lies madness. And so if it is Wally, and I still think there's a good chance that it is, I don't think he's going to be that guy. He's not going to be doing that with his unusual vantage point, from the external vantage point on this new 52 reality that we've all been reading about for the past 5 years.
Right. I mean, outside of that, the only other thing I could sort of possibly make any kind of like speculation on is you would sort of have to go through the canon of DC, maybe through Who's Who, and say, okay, who have we not seen since either pre-Crisis or pre-Flashpoint? But my feeling is like, could they, did they go, is there a character that we absolutely have not seen either from the Golden Age to Silver Age that kind of personifies the DC universe? And that's a very short list, if it even exists at all,
Yeah, I don't think there are too many characters that A, represent the DC universe, archetypally, and B, we haven't seen in a very long time, because DC just keeps resurrecting and rehashing, as we've said, these things over and over again.
Right. I mean, there really is. I mean, there's just nobody. You can't, unless the only other thing is that it's a total wild card, and it's like, Pariah, Harbinger, or Booster Gold, as somebody's speculated, or Wave Rider, which would be ridiculous. So
for children of the '90s, it would be fun.
What's that?
For children of the '90s, it would be fun.
That's true. So it's a surprise. It's a legitimate surprise. I really am stumped, and I can't wait to read the issue.
Yeah, you and me both. But now I'm even more excited now that you've thrown Superman of Earth 1's hat into the ring.
That would be crazy. I mean, when I look at the image, like I said, it does look like it's gloved.
Yes,
but
no reason why Kal-El wouldn't have taken to wearing gloves after being chucked out of his home reality.
Sure. And who knows? Maybe the image that they keep showing is not the one that we'll see on the fully on the cover. They've been known to do that too.
Yes, they have. That's right. So it's just a little bit of excitement there.
There you go.
Crisis doings in the near future. But now let's turn our attention to some crisis doings in the past. Ready to start talking about Crisis on Infinite Earths number 3 again?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's jump back in. I believe the last thing we looked at the end of episode 14 was the top row of panels at the top of page 16. As we see the imageable headshots of the 4 human members of the Losers. Pooch was not present, but Gunner, Sarge, Johnny Cloud, and Captain Storm, as they all vanish into the antimatter. They were called the Losers, but they were winners to the end. That's where we left off.
Mm-hmm.
Then, moment of silence in between episodes, and now we come back into it And Sergeant Rock and Easy Company, after witnessing with horror what has just happened, they jump into action. So, yeah, Sergeant Rock yells, "Move it, Easy Company, now!" And acting in concert with the crew of the haunted tank, all these DC war characters open fire with their GI weapons. And then the shadow demons starts, spilling out in greater numbers of the vibrational tower that on which the losers were trying to scale the tower when the shadow demons popped out and attacked them. And now even more of them come out and take the battle to the ground troops. And the first casualty there is a member of the Easy Company called Flower. He's he succumbs to the deadly embrace of a shadow demon. And all that's left is his helmet with the little flower blossoms pinned to it, lying there in the snow. Sergeant Rock is all set to just hurl himself bodily at the shadow demon, mad with grief over the loss of one of his men. And it's Jeb Stewart, Lieutenant Jeb Stewart of the haunted tank, that I think tackles him and says, "Nothing ever makes sense in war, Rock, and you know that." And then a concerted effort by Dr. Polaris and Geoforce. They train both their powers on the shadow demon, and with a scrah sound effect down in the lower right, it shatters. Interesting visual there. Okay, that brings us to the bottom of the page. Let's back up a little bit. The moment when talk about Flower a little bit here. When he buys the farm, so to speak, I did actually focus on that for a paragraph in my thesis. I think this is the only quote from my thesis I have for this episode, but it's on page 64 for those of you reading along at home. Oh, wait a minute. No, it isn't. It's on page. Oh boy. I had the right page. Here we go. Page 61. Okay. A soldier named Flower, a peace-loving farm boy and archetypal innocent, is slain by antimatter and vanishes in a white flash. Although death in war, and even in comics about war, of which DC Comics has published many, is hardly unusual, such an eerie, unnatural death against the backdrop of the much idealized Last Good War, i.e. World War II, creates a strong impression that there is another war afoot on a higher plane, i.e. the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, a war exhibiting outlandish differences from any before seen and in which the stakes are frighteningly high. Flower's horrified commanding officer, Sergeant Rock, DC's most iconic war-themed character, gives voice to the feeling of the reader who has just had his or her generic expectations shockingly violated yet again. He disappeared. Things like that don't happen in war. These ruptures add to the pervasive atmosphere of apocalyptic horror that is so important to Crisis, laying bare the mortality of beloved characters and their worlds as familiar myths crack open and bleed narrative chaos. But they also make a bold statement about DC Comics' dedication to permanently disrupting and redefining business as usual in the DC universe. So, yes, the death of Flower is another good example of how the many moments in this series when Wolfman and Perez set up just kind of like an archetypal little vignette, something very typical of the storytelling formulas in a particular genre or in the life of a particular character, and then having something crazy related to Crisis show up and rip that scene wide open to shock the reader out of his or her complacency. Flower dying does that nicely.
Now, there's some thought that Flower is really Farm Boy.
Jaxer on the forums, also known as my friend Professor Chuck Coletta, who teaches pop culture at Bowling Green. He was one of my friends on the faculty when I was earning my master's there, when I was writing this thesis. He posted a bunch of thoughts about Crisis number 3 on our forums a while ago, and we'll be referring back to those in this episode as we did in the last one. And he is convinced that Flower and Farm Boy are one and the same character. And he opines that the creators could have swapped in a more prominent member of Easy Company, like Bulldozer or Wildman or Little Sure Shot or somebody, and maybe it would have had more of an impact. And instead, they went with Flower. And Jaxer is of the opinion that Flower and Farm Boy are the same character. I'm not so sure personally.
Right? Yeah, I don't know why. When they're that meticulous about their notes and all of that, why would they get that wrong, if that's the right word, I don't think that wrong really isn't exactly the right word, but I know what you're saying. Why would they
Well, okay, maybe it is. Well, okay. Why would they change the name of the character if they're keeping such careful track of which characters they're using? Why would they just go ahead and rename Farm Boy Flower out of the clear blue sky?
Right.
Although I do have a thought on that. Not necessarily why they changed Farm Boy's name to Flower, because I'm not convinced that's what they actually did, but why they went with this Flower person, why they created a new member of Easy Company to kill instead of just sacrificing Farm Boy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they wanted a character that had kind of Farm Boy's easygoing, gentle, country-raised good nature, his farm boy value, his agrarian values, but who was a little more indicative of pacifism and gentleness, and also the flower child era, the innocence, naivete. You could see him as kind of a stand-in for the Silver Age of DC Comics, which is kind of a sacrificial lamb as a part of this whole Crisis revamp of DC Comics, their world, and how they do business. They're trying to leave the Silver Age behind them and streamline themselves and reinvent themselves for the 80s. And so here's this figure who's got, even though he's having adventures during World War II, he's got flowers in his helmet, and he kind of looks like almost kind of hippie-ish with all those flowers pinned all over himself, and his unwillingness to engage in violence unless it's to protect an innocent from harm. We saw him shooting a Nazi officer to death on page 13 to protect Dr. Polaris and an innocent flower lady from being shot to death by that same Nazi. But even though this is happening during the 40s, a lot of these war comics were published in the 60s, and DC's heyday as DC Comics, you might say, their second heyday as a publishing entity of any name, did happen in the 60s. And by the 80s, they were kind of stuck in a rut and were trying to get themselves out of that rut. And a lot of what they decided to change and overhaul in Crisis is represents an act of getting that 60s baggage off their chests. And I guess you could look at the sacrifice of this Flower character, if you see him as like a personification of a certain aspect of DC's 60s naivete. Yeah, so that's a possible interpretation of this character's intro in this issue and his death.
I just looked up online Easy Company's entry in Who's Who number 7, and it's Farmer Boy, so my apologies, I said Farm Boy. It's Farmer Boy. He does have a flower in his helmet, and he's planting the flower inside his helmet in the larger image. But they call him Farmer Boy. He's blonde. And Who's Who number 7 came out around the time of Crisis number 6. So, I mean, I don't know when they drew all these images up. It was by Joe Kubert. If maybe they didn't know at the time, they don't make any reference to Crisis on it. So, I don't know. It's curious. It's just a curious little fact that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, that's the fact that the Who's Who entry shows Farmer Boy with a. I got that wrong too, and well, so did Chuck for that matter on the forums. The fact that he had a flower on his helmet does maybe come to. It should be reason to step back and reassess a little bit, perhaps. But
yeah, strange.
I'm looking at the official Crisis Index from ICG, and they. Darn it, I'm on the wrong page yet again. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, here we go. Flower, first appearance. So they're regarding him as a separate and distinct character from Farmer Boy. First appearance, a soldier in Easy Company, not to be confused with Commandy's late female companion, who is also named Flower, dies in this story. Which is funny because if you go to Comic Book DB and you go to the listing for Crisis number 3 and click on Flower in the listing of characters involved in this issue, you'll discover that whoever put the character profile together for Flower made exactly that mistake. Because there are appearances for Flower in this issue of Crisis and also in issues of Commandy. So clearly, it's not the same Flower.
Yeah. Well, the only other notes I have for this page, I liked the destruction of the Shadow Demon, especially when gives credence to why are these characters paired up, and one of the aspects is look how well Dr. Polaris and Geoforce, when they work together, gravity versus magnetism. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, the powers really do complement each other pretty well now that you mention it.
Yeah. And I do like Sergeant Rock's quote about, he said he disappeared. Later on we'll see shadow demons touching people and they quite literally explode. But this version of it, at this point anyway, he said he disappeared. So you sort of take it as it's almost like the antimatter cloud too. They're just vanishing.
Yeah,
they're being wiped out of existence.
Yeah, just looking how he is reduced to a white, just white with outlines in blue, exactly like the people who were killed by the antimatter wall. And of course, the wall is right there behind them, so maybe the shadow demon is dragging him into the antimatter.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, because when Sergeant Rock is being saved, the wall is pretty close.
Yeah, I think that's what I must have thought because in my thesis, that passage I read, I said that Flower was killed by antimatter.
Oh, okay. It's hard. It's difficult because the panel before it, when one of the Nazis gets it, it looks more like just one of those shadow demons is just enveloping him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you mean. The wall is not so close in that panel.
Right. Yeah, there's inconsistencies that don't matter in the long run, right. But it's kind of fun to just point them out.
They did. That's all that matters.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so the fight scene continues in page 17. The Blue Beetle has been hovering above all of this in his bug aircraft this whole time. He's up there questioning his value to this whole operation. He's wondering to himself why the Monitor even picked him to be a part of the Great 15. So he decides to swing himself down on a little trapeze cable, jumps down onto the tower that they're supposed to be protecting, and he's got an internal monologue going on where he continues to question himself. It's just classic. It's a classic trope for this kind of character. He's of the Spider-Man school. It's surprising because this version of the Blue Beetle was created by Steve Ditko, co-creator of Spider-Man. So he jumps down there and he's wondering to himself, I'm a scientist. Maybe that's why I'm here in the first place. My vibratory tower is as far beyond me as an IBM is to a Neanderthal, but I'm going to give it a try. So he jumps down, and Shadow Demon's hand reaches out of the tower, grabs him by the shoulder, and he convulses in pain. And then suddenly, before he can dissolve into antimatter or explode or do whatever it is Shadow Demons do to people, the Shadow Demon explodes. Which leaves Ted a little mystified. His arm is hanging limply at his side there in that panel in the middle of the page as it continues to smoke or seethe at the contact of the Shadow Demon's hand. And then all of a sudden it dawns on him, of course, the scarab the original Blue gave me. Dan Garrett said it had mystical powers. Thank heaven for little bugs. And then he's left standing there watching a small horde of the Shadow Demons closing in on him, wondering how do I take advantage of this? How do I weaponize this little Blue Beetle magic scarab even further? Because he can't use it on all of these Shadow Demons at once, and he can't use it at all without hurting himself. And then in the lower right, Geoforce and Dr. Polaris come to the conclusion that oh, yes, this is what the Shadow Demons are trying to do. This is their play. They're trying to separate us. They're trying to distract us from the tower and hurt us away from it. So they're kind of on to their little scheme there. And let's hop to the top of page 18 to finish this sequence. The Blue Beetle is doing his acrobat thing, hopping around, avoiding the touch of the Shadow Demons, thinking to himself, this is wonderful. I can destroy these shadow thingies with the Beetle Scarab, but to do so, they have to touch and burn me. Not exactly an equitable trade. And the Blue Beetle then he takes a bad step as he's avoiding one Shadow Demon's lunge, falls from the tower. He shouts for help from Geoforce. Geoforce doesn't hear him. Blue Beetle says to himself, this is it, but watching from above as we cut from the actual scene of the action to seeing it through the scopes of the monitor on his orbiting satellite, the monitor says to himself, despite his lack of powers, I was hoping the Blue Beetle's scarab could aid in my mission here. So suddenly the monitor remembers and bears out Blue Beetle's reasoning for why, in fact, the Blue Beetle was a part of this group to begin with. It's because of this magic little jewel that he had. Then the monitor goes on to say, unfortunately, that was not the case. His assistance is no longer required. Thus, I shall return him and the other wounded one to their own time, where they may await the Earth's fate along with the rest of her children. So, zip. He presses a button. Blue Beetle, he has been expelled from the Great 15, and he's gone back to, well, we don't know yet at this point what Earth he's going back to, but we later learn that it's in fact Earth 4, and that the Charlton Comics characters had their own Earth, and that he's been a citizen of that Earth all along. And so let's cut there for a moment and
sure,
think about a couple of things.
Yeah, especially because Monitor right there at the end, he says, I shall return him and the other wounded one to their own time. So he's not even saying, sort of, it's still in that keeping of, is Wolfman thinking Ted Kord is from Earth 1, you know, if both him and we'll see that he's going to send Solivar as well. They're both, you know, like, it's sort of like, why wouldn't he say Earths if he knew at this point that Blue Beetle is from Earth 4, you know? It almost feels like he still doesn't know quite yet.
Yeah. On the other hand, he says, where they may await the Earth's singular fate along with the rest of her children.
Yeah.
So he's talking about a single Earth here, and we know Solivar is from Earth 1.
Right.
So I guess if people wanted to believe that Ted Kord had been living on the same Earth with the rest of DC's heroes all this time, they could.
Yeah, because we don't know yet that Earth 2 is also being... we've just been focusing on Earth 1 this whole issue.
Yes, we have.
Yeah. I just have a couple things real quick. I love the vertical panel on page 17, the first panel, kind of just show the bug up above, the height of the tower, the battle below. It's a really nice perspective shot there.
Mm-hmm. Good way to show altitude.
Yeah, it's a good establishing shot. And it's great that, you know, if you don't know who Blue Beetle is, we learn a lot here, whether it's factual or not. You know, we learn he's a scientist. We learn about a little bit about the scarab, even though, you know, there's question whether he should actually have the scarab at this point. He certainly doesn't have it post-crisis when his series kicks off. So that was kind of it's just nice to give Blue Beetle some more Crisis page time, you know, since he is such a new character to the DC universe.
Oh, yes. Yeah, looking again at the official Crisis Index, as I'm sure you did too, Peter. It says Blue Beetle, he's listed in the guest stars column for this issue, mistakenly referred to as possessing the mystic scarab of Dan Garrett, the original Blue Beetle in this story. And he next appears in issue number 6 after the Monitor zaps him away here. And I think when we see him at that point, he makes mention of having lost the scarab since the last time we saw him.
I don't remember. So
that could be another untold Crisis tale, or how he got the scarab in the first place, for that matter.
Yeah. And it does look like when the Shadow Demon grabs him, that's a little bit closer to what I'm used to seeing when the Shadow Demon touches someone. You know, sort of that electric Kirby dot, which will turn into sort of like an explosion more than
right.
Yeah, so that was good to see. I have a note here, and I'm not sure if we talked about it last episode, but it was more of a question to myself. Why a tuning fork in World War II? You know, we're told that these forks are going to great heroic eras of the DC universe, of our own, you know, sort of DC universe, but of these worlds. And so far we've seen one in, where was the first one? In Atlantis, last issue.
Great Disaster.
The Great Disaster, right. So 2 of them, we're pretty sure Earth 1, possibly. Now World War I. And certainly in terms of DC's publishing, I mean, you know, Sergeant Rock, Weird War Tales, Star Spangled Comics, Haunted Tank, The Losers, you know, there's tons of Enemy Ace, there's tons of World War I, or just war books in general. So I think it's kind of obvious why they would want to send a tuning fork to that particular heroic era. I think I said last time that, were the tuning forks placed, could it be seen as them being placed in an era that Marv Wolfman wanted to make sure still existed post-Crisis as well? Like, hey, don't forget about these universes. Let's use the fork so that we can showcase eras that we can't really keep showcasing in the larger narrative, but we can give them little touches here and there.
Right. It would be a lot harder to work the Old West, for example, into a story like this unless he came up with a device of this kind.
Exactly. And then sort of give these characters a last little hurrah, but also sort of to say, look, we're not going to forget about you necessarily in the long run, but even if we don't see you for a while, you'll still be part of our history. So I kind of like that.
Yeah. Though I got to ask myself, if they were doing the same thing now, would they? I mean, they'd probably still put one in the World War II era because that's the birth of the superhero. Period.
Mm-hmm.
So that would absolutely make the short list. But would there be a tuning fork tower in, say, ancient Atlantis if there was no Arion Lord of Atlantis book on the shelves at that time?
Yeah, I mean the only thing I could sort of think is the Legion Future. You could definitely drop one off there.
Oh yeah,
but we don't necessarily play around with they could have dropped one off at Skataris in Warlord's World, or but that's more, I guess, a little bit more dimensional as opposed to era. Yeah. So it's that's a good question. I would have to think about that, but there aren't many books that take place outside of the current DC continuity. And then that's all I have for that page.
All right. Okay, so jumping then back to mid of page 18, as the Monitor provides an interesting little segue there, as he talks about returning the Blue Beetle and the other wounded one to their own time. And so we get this horizontal panel in the middle. It's like this horizontal bar with a little circular panel on either side. One of them showing the conflict in Markovia in World War II. The other one showing the simultaneous. Well, if simultaneity can have any meaning when we're talking about different time periods, but the conflict that's going on in the future world that's coming, the age of the Great Disaster, Commandy's world, where we've got Earth 2 Superman, Solivar, Dawnstar, and a couple of others not on panel. But down there at the bottom of the page, Earth 2 Superman, apparently there's a break in the battle with the Shadow Demons. They seem to have driven them off for the time being. But Earth 2 Superman is just standing there looking grim and imposing, and he's watching this giant lightning bolt leap across a red sky, and he's musing to himself, first red skies, now electrical storms. It's just as the Monitor predicted. Dawnstar, is it wrong for a Superman to say he's frightened? It's kind of a convention of writing Superman comics in the late Bronze Age, early Copper Age. Just talking about a Superman with the indefinite article on there, as if Superman is more than just one person. It's a title. It's a class of hero that just happens to be occupied by, well, in this case, Kal-El of Earth 2, but Kal-El of Earth 1 most often when a Superman. That phrase is used. Dawnstar asks him about his wife, and Earth 2 Superman says, I am, and I may never see my wife again. Lois, wherever you are, I love you. And then an even more tender and poignant scene is taking place between Kamandi, the last boy on Earth, and Solivar, king of Gorilla City. Two characters readers never realized they wanted to see share a touching scene, and yet here Wolfman and Perez are giving it to us. Bottom of page 18, Solivar has just rescued Kamandi and sustained an injury in so doing, and Solivar's speech is starting to falter. And top of page 19, he feels himself being tugged away. He knows what's happening, and he murmurs to Kamandi that it was a pleasure to have met you, and he collapses and. He mumbles something to Kamandi that's a little strange now that I'm reading it again. I saw the future, lad, and for you there are so many changes awaiting. Be good. And Commandy pleads with him not to leave him, and then he repeats, be good. It's a sort of E.T. fashion, and then bzzz, there's just one panel of pink and white energy being released, and that is the effect of the Monitor sending him back to Gorilla City, having fallen in battle. And Commandy rages a little bit. I won't accept this. Everyone I've ever known leaves me. My parents abandoned me in that command keep, which is a fact that will be pertinent to Commandy before Crisis is over, actually, reminding us that he was left in Command D bunker as a kid. My friends either died or left. So because this takes us back to Commandy's, where he was in his personal continuity at this point. He'd had a falling out with his companions, Ben Boxer, Dr. Canis, and he was on his own at the time that the Monitor's tower appeared and all of this happened to him. And now he's lost yet another friend. And Superman of Earth 2 remarks, Commandy, everything is changing around us. Our lives are all being affected by some unknown force. We must stay together or we'll all perish alone. So, safety in numbers. So there's our little vignette in the time of the Great Disaster.
I love these 2 half pages. There's so much in it. I love it.
Such as?
Well, to go back to the little thing that Solivar said, like what you mentioned about, okay, first off, I think we talked about it last episode, a wise, very human ape in the world of the Great Disaster, in the world of Commandy, is already going to speak volumes if you know that in Commandy's universe, if an ape is coming your way, you better run.
Right.
It's sort of the whole Planet of the Apes kind of thing.
Right. He's been taught by learned experience to distrust any kind of talking animal. And he remarks, I'm sure we talked about this in the last episode, I think it was an earlier issue when he looked at Solivar's eyes and says that they're softer and kinder than those of most of the other animals he's met in this world.
Yeah, and it just speaks to Marv Wolfman's credibility, or if he got notes from an editor or some other creator. I mean, to just pair these two is so brilliant. I mean, it really is. It's a great showcase of the DC characters and how one can affect the other. So that's awesome. And then this whole thing about him saying, "I've had a vision, a premonition of the future." Why would Solivar, of all characters, if he's almost on his death, if it's sort of the whole thing, life passes before your eyes or in death, because I think you pointed out in some of your thesis material, or maybe we have in these conversations, the post-crisis DC universe is the way we get to it is everybody has to die. Everybody dies a little death, right down to the readers. We all die. We all have to be reborn, recreated. And, here's Solivar practically almost on his deathbed, maybe, if you want to look at it that way, when he passes out. And he gets to see what's going to happen. It's amazing, especially if you know what is going to happen to Commandy in issue 12. It's such an interesting thing that Wolfman would actually tease this early, issue 3, because he knows what the purpose of Crisis is. Wolfman knows that his hope is to revamp and relaunch the DC universe, and that things will have changes. One of those changes is that DC has way too many futures at this point. Where does the Great Disaster fit between 1986 and the trippy space stories of DC's 1950s comics, where some of those take place in the year 20 something, or some of them probably even take place like in 1995.
I think they did, yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to already start to tease the outcome of Crisis on Infinite Earths, because I don't even think Monitor has to this point. Nobody has sort of made a suggestion, I don't think, that there could be something other after this in story. So I think that's just a fascinating panel.
Right, let alone that that anything would survive, let alone that it would survive in an altered or a revised form.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. That is a really cool and interesting example of distorted foreshadowing there. Yeah, and it is a little odd that Salivar is the one that notices all of this. And so, as you said, people usually flash back on their own lives, not flash forward on other people's lives. But then again, he's an ape. He sees things a little differently than most people would, and he's an ape with tremendous force of mind powers as well. So maybe this is something that the denizens of Gorilla City, especially those with powerful psychic abilities, can do.
Yeah.
And it makes me think also of something I learned while reading Michael Crichton's Congo a while ago. Gorillas, as far as people who primatologists have been able to learn, they conceive of time a little differently than human beings do. They don't get human idioms like that's in the past, that's behind us, because they don't see themselves as walking forward into the future. They see themselves as keeping their backs to the future and looking back on their past all the time. So, I don't know, maybe keeping that in mind, it makes having a psychic gorilla seeing the future at his moment of death make a little more sense. I don't know.
That's fascinating. And I don't know, I wrote down, I don't think this really speaks to anything, but, first he says be wise, but then he says be good. So I thought that was an interesting little change of what he wants them to do, but I don't necessarily think it means anything. It's just sort of words.
Yeah. I've always wondered why Wolfman had him say be good twice, too.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I can think of is that he was channeling E.T.
The other thing I love about this relates to Dawnstar and Superman. First of all, on page 18, it has to be trippy on Dawnstar's part to be talking to quite possibly the third Superman she's met in her existence.
Yeah, right?
If you want to think of Superboy, Superman, both of them of Earth 1, and now the Earth 2 Superman, I was trying to think, I'm pretty sure there was didn't one of the JLA, JSA team-ups feature the Legion, or was it just JLA and Legion?
Oh, no, the JSA was definitely involved.
Do you remember if Earth 2 Superman was involved in that?
I don't offhand. I don't have my Crisis on Multiple Earths trades with me, and I haven't read that far forward into them either. Yeah,
I could probably look it up, but it really doesn't mean too much. I mean, I'm surprised I haven't read that one yet.
Yeah. I think I remember, though, that there being a Bronze Age story someplace which involved the Legion encountering the young Earth 2 Clark Kent, who, of course, never became Superboy. That wasn't a part of the Earth 2 Superman's continuity. And I think they gave him a little bit of training or advice or something in the course of that one little throwaway story. But yeah, other than that, I don't think the Legion before Crisis had much truck with Earth 2.
Yeah. I think that's just got, just on her end alone, it's got to be like, what's going on here? And then, so there's that part I thought was kind of interesting. But then the other thing at the end there, we can pull a lot of meta textual kind of stuff out of this. Superman's line about there's an unknown force. All our lives are being affected by some unknown force. Well, insert unknown force. You could insert reader demand, DC demand, the Wolfman. You can anything and everything. You can take that so metatextually,
right. Yeah, whatever that unknown force is, you could read it as the Anti-Monitor, or you can read it as you say, any number of things coming from, well, if you will, Earth Prime's universe, or perhaps more accurately, reality.
Right.
Since Earth Prime is just as affected by the events of Crisis as anything else. And so Earth Prime is kind of represented as just another parallel universe that happens not to have any superheroes on it, except a Superboy and Ultra, but he doesn't even factor into Crisis. And just other than that, just resembles reality an awful lot. But yeah. Whole sidebar there, but Earth Prime does not necessarily equal the world on which this podcast is being recorded.
Right. And I guess I should really read my notes a little deeper here. To go back to Kamandi and Salivar. So I wrote here, how and why could that happen to Salivar? Could it just boil down to the breaking down of the multiverse? where the walls of the multiverse break down, the bleed, and that those that are sensitive or could be sensitive to such things could actually perceive beyond the veil, so to speak.
So if, say, Saturn Girl had been dying on that tuning fork aside Commandy, she might have seen the same thing that Solivar did?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at all of them, all the characters that are there, Commandy, Superman, Dawnstar, and Solivar, out of all of them, the one that is most affected by the crisis is Commandy. That's safe to say, right? In terms of who they are pre-crisis versus post-crisis.
Yeah, okay. I'll grant you that. I mean, Earth 2 Superman certainly was affected a great deal too, but he wasn't essentially changed. He was just kind of banished. His whole world was yanked out from under him. But he himself was not changed. Right.
So, I guess like what you said about Solivar's abilities, of all of them there, I guess if he's feeling anything time-related or multiverse-related, it's probably going to come from Commandy himself. And I wrote here, it's an interesting nugget, it's an interesting thought or exploration that Wolfman doesn't really go too deep into, but Morrison certainly does later. And then also in Infinite Crisis, with the death of Superman Earth 2, spoilers for that, he does say on his deathbed, when he says Lois was right, he saw whatever she saw too, and what that was the eventual, or the idea that everything was still in existence, or that the multiverse would return. It's almost a hypertime kind of concept in a way. When they're freed from the shackles of DC publishing, they realize that there's a larger DC world out there.
Right. Their mind or soul can range across the arbitrary boundaries of continuity far better than their bodies could.
Yeah, it's Coyote. It's the Coyote gospel all over, man.
Different episode. But still fondly remembered by longtime CGS fans.
Oh, yeah. And then the only other thing I have here is when Superman says, is it wrong for a Superman to say he's frightened? I don't know why this thought kicked in, but I wrote here, does the Earth 2 pre-crisis Superman, is his existence weighed down by the destruction of Krypton? Or is that more is that part of Earth 1 Superman's identity more? You know what I mean?
A lot more. Yeah, I don't think Earth 2 Superman spent all that much time, well, comparatively at least, thinking about his lost homeworld. For one thing, I think he was younger than Earth 1 Superman was when he was rocketed away from Krypton. I think he was an infant, whereas the Earth 1 Kal-El was more like 2 years old. He could actually remember some things about Krypton. Superman could not. I think he was an adult before he even learned where he came from. I think that there actually is a Golden Age story about that.
Interesting. I'm not sure why that tipped me into that thought process, but I thought that was, I guess some of it has to do with just trying to delineate between the two characters a little bit more. And,
which is what I live for.
Yeah, and it does affect how they relate to other characters as well, or how people relate to them.
Sure.
Yeah.
If the more little details that can show you the differences between you, that establish them as separate characters as opposed to just cheap reflections of each other.
Mm-hmm. And the only other thing I wrote was when Commandy starts to lose it after Solivar disappears. Excuse me. I wrote Commandy gets a little bit self-centered. Don't leave me, blah, blah, blah. And I wrote, well, I mean, he is the last boy on Earth, not the last man. So,
tiny bit immature, and I think under the circumstances he can be forgiven for that.
Sure.
But Superman, ever the strong father figure, tries to reassure him. Even as reality is coming apart at the seams, he's trying to comfort this shrieking, grieving child.
Did you have anything about those pages?
Nope.
No?
I think we covered it. So now it's time to move on to another very important sequence here.
Yeah, I love this sequence coming up.
Jump into another part of DC history that hasn't been seen so far in this series. The town is Coyote, Texas. The year is 1879. And as Superman says, the world is changing, although some things remain the same. So there we are. That whole idea of consistency and change, generic formulae, safe storytelling methods that are and patterns that have been well established over the years, and that Crisis is ripping apart. So here we are getting plunged into yet another one of those familiar scenarios. And so we're now in the DC Universe's Old West, circa 1879. And at the bottom of page 19, enter, ass first, Batlash, getting tossed out of a saloon. And a word balloon says, "And stay out, Batlash." And before he even hits the ground, his charm is kicking in, and he's saying, "I'm sure there was just some misunderstanding." Yes, there he is, Batlash. Will he save the West or ruin it? And he lands on the ground at the top of page 20. There's this long line of vituperation he's getting from the madam of the establishment, Mrs. Gofui, with her pretty young daughter there behind her. Apparently that Batlash, who is a notorious womanizer, has been playing up to Miss Gofui, and she's kind of giving him the eye behind her mother, just looking at him with one little finger up to her mouth, and Bat gives her a gesture and says, "Nice meeting you too, Mrs. Gofui," as he rides off against the horizon. Got an internal monologue going on, mentioning him, in which he reveals, it's just the same. It's just as well that I got kicked out of there. I didn't come all the way to Coyote just for a warm embrace. And he mentions that a friend of his, Kewonote, has sent him a telegram, gathering together a small group of Western characters, do-gooders of the Old West, wanting to investigate a strange phenomenon that Kewonote, alias Scalp Hunter, has discovered. And sure enough, right there on top of an old abandoned mine, we've got another one of the Monitor's vibratory towers. So Bat, why do I keep wanting to say Flash? Batlash pulls up next to the opening into the mine, sees a couple of other horses reined in there, and he's thinking to himself, and he enters, and he's greeted by Kewonote, Scalp Hunter, and with him are some other DC Western characters, Jonah Hex, Nighthawk, and Johnny Thunder. And a few of these guys know each other already. Scalp Hunter and Jonah Hex have both met Batlash and each other. And Johnny Thunder and Nighthawk are characters that hadn't seen quite as much use in DC Comics recently. Part of that is probably that they're older DC Western characters. They hail from the 40s, whereas Hex, Batlash, and Scalp Hunter were all created in the late 60s, early 70s. So that if DC creators of the 70s and 80s wanted to tell a story with Western characters and cross them over with superhero characters, which had happened a couple of times, those were the ones they were more likely to reach for. So this group of characters all come together. The top of page 21, they're all still surveying the scene, sharing theories about what this big tuning fork-shaped thing in their midst happens to be. Scalp Hunter, who is the master tracker, observes that no birds fly near it, no animals approach. And he's attuned to these things. Johnny Thunder notes that sometimes you even see shadows moving across it. We know what that means. Jonah Hex wants to know why nobody's bothered to try calling the army, since he's an ex-military man himself, albeit on the Confederate side. Nighthawk says, "Don't rightly know, Mr. Hex, but your names suddenly came to Scalp Hunter and me." Just came to them, just popped into their heads. And Scalp Hunter adds, "It's as if we were told to summon you." And at that point, Nighthawk excuses himself, says, "I'm going to get us some weapons just in case." And so he moseys on out of the cave. And at that point, members of the Monitor's crew of champions, the Great 15, appear to join up with the rendezvous with the local talent, which I think we can assume is probably part of the Monitor's plan. And so let's pause for a moment right there. I'm going to throw in a note or two from Chuck Coletta here.
Okay.
He reminds us that Batlash, who recalls James Garner's Brett Maverick from the TV show Maverick, has popped up several times over the years. One of his creators is Sergio Aragones of Mad Magazine, who returned to the Western dandy in a nice 2008 miniseries subtitled Guns N' Roses. And that's true. I think that's actually I think the first thing Sergio ever did for DC back in the 60s was like a romance story of some kind about like a flamenco dancer or something. And then the second thing he did was the first appearance of Batlash. And also something about Nighthawk. Nighthawk was later retconned in 2002 as a former reincarnation of the Golden Age Hawkman Carter Hall. The female Western character Cinnamon, not seen in this issue, was the reincarnation of the Golden Age Hawkgirl. Nighthawk and Cinnamon were also referenced on a recent episode of The Flash Power Outage on a movie poster. I saw that. And the coolest thing of all that Chuck has to say about this scene, here we go. Pages 20 to 23, this scene with the Western heroes, is referenced in a 2012 song called Westerner by a French-Canadian electro-rock band called Judge Rock. And you can find that. I did a little web searching. If you go to Judge Rock, all one word, .bandcamp.com/track/Westerner, you will find it, and it is very obviously about this scene in Crisis Number 3. There's even one of the panels at the top of page 21, I think, is reproduced there. It's Perez's art. It's shown in negative color scheme though, kind of trippy looking. And the song's like 10 minutes long. I can't say that much for it musically. It's really kind of weird and distorted sounding and slow and dirge-like, and the lead singer has a pretty thick French accent, but the lyrics are all about it mentions all of the characters by name: Jonah Hex, Nighthawk, etc. So it's not such a great song, but it's just cool that somebody actually saw fit to write a song about these Western characters gathering, to face the twilight of their world. Although they don't mention antimatter in that song. In the song Westerner, they're all just, they encounter aliens who take them out into space back to their home planet.
Just add that to the list of songs about comics.
Which is not that long at this point, but every little entry helps, and it's probably the only song on the list of songs about Crisis.
Or at least songs that reference comics, there's quite a number of those.
References a specific story, and that is pretty rare no matter how you look at it.
Yeah. I love this sequence. I don't know why. I think it, again, the whole thing, tuning fork in one of the eras, Wild Wild West, DC certainly published a ton of Westerns. I mean, the entire comics medium was Westerns and war stories at one point or another.
Right, like the 50s primarily, I think, that was the heyday. Well, late 40s and 50s.
Yeah. So, yes, you have, like you said, in a story like this, the only way you could sort of bring them to the forefront is to create a narrative, a subplot within a larger plot, which is something I never really even thought about until you said it. This is in story structure terms, that is great. You showcase all of these characters within your universe. Well, how do you do that? I know. We'll get some tuning forks that they won't actually know what to do with, but we'll stick them in anyway, and then we can showcase these characters. So what do we think of the date 1879? I mean, does it make sense with the Wild West concept or the Wild West genre to begin with? I mean, is it, I can't imagine that they were all really truly contemporaries in their own individual stories, but there's only so many. I would have to imagine there's only, a handful of decades that you could put these stories in, Wild West stories.
Right. Now, the Old West, as contemporary people imagine it, probably didn't exist for that many decades. And especially when you have Jonah Hex thrown in there, and his personal history requires that this be a certain number of years after the end of the Civil War.
Right.
So, yeah, it makes sense for him, and they can just, work the rest of the characters in as needed.
Yeah, because I think I saw somewhere that Scalp Hunter has actually a specific birth date, around like 1830, I think it is.
Now, is that for James Robinson's Starman, or is that from something else?
Right, that's what I mean. It could be a retcon, it could be later stuff, it could be post-crisis information. Batlash is certainly young here, So I just thought it was kind of cool, it seemed a little bit odd this time around when I say, oh, yeah. But I guess that makes sense if that's something that Wolfman is trying to build. He's trying to build, not only trying to make sense of the multiverse and the futures and all the outcome, but also make sense of the DC universe proper as well.
Right, just string it all together on one coherent timeline, past, present, and future.
Yeah.
I guess he was just trying to collapse the Old West down into one epitomic year. And now your guess is as good as mine as to why he latched on to 1879 in particular. What it means most to me is that it's exactly 100 years before I was born.
Well, there you go. This was definitely my introduction to Batlash. I was reading Jonah Hex as a kid. I read a couple issues of Jonah Hex, so Batlash and the other ones I didn't know about. But no, I lie. There was that JLA JSA team up of random characters like Jonah Hex and
Miss Liberty.
Yeah,
historic characters.
Some of the other Western characters involved in that too.
Well, there was a story, and it's actually there is a direct reference made to the story I'm talking about in this issue.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was a couple issues of JLA, and I think Chuck has something about that in his notes too. But yeah, I think the story you mentioned first was just like a random grouping of historical characters. Like Miss Liberty was in there, the Black Pirate was in there, and I think there was a Westerner, and it might have been Jonah Hex.
There was a Viking.
Oh, right, like Viking Prince, possibly?
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm looking it up.
And while you do, I can say that Batlash was actually the one of these Western characters that I knew of first. I think he's the only one of these characters that I had encountered before. Well, maybe Jonah Hex. I might have seen reference to him, too, because he was appearing in a couple of Vertigo miniseries written by Joe R. Lansdale when I was just getting into comics in the early 90s. But Batlash, I actually have his first appearance from Showcase number 76.
Oh.
Beaten all to crap, but it was part of one of several piles of comics that my dad dug up for me at yard sales back in the early 90s, around the time I was getting started reading comics. And I was like, oh, okay, here's a comic about an old cowboy. But he was a cowboy character with a difference. I mean, even then, in 1960, whatever that was, he had that flower in his hat, and he's that big cheesy grin on his face. The paisley vests that he used to wear. The late '60s was kind of a restructuring period for the whole Western genre. At Bowling Green, we learned about something called the genre cycle. I probably mentioned it on an earlier episode of the Crisis Tapes here, where different genres of popular entertainment go through peaks and valleys, ebbs and waxing and wanings, ebbs and flows of popularity, and they go through definite stages as they walk this winding way. And the Western had kind of passed a peak of popularity, which it experienced in the 50s, as we said, both in comics and other media of entertainment, TV and movies. And it was kind of coming back into prominence in the late 60s and in different interpretations. Like, people were trying to resuscitate the Western by doing different takes on it, like the Western comedy. A good example of that would be 1969's Cat Ballou. And so Batlash kind of was a part of that, part of the life cycle of the Western genre. Reinventing Westerns and Western characters as cowboys and daring rogues and comedic figures, as opposed to just straightforward white hat versus black hat action heroes.
Yeah. So that was Justice League of America 198 and 199, featuring Batlash, Cinnamon, Jonah Hex, and Scalp Hunter. And Green Lantern, obviously, Hal Jordan was part of that story, so that's why they, as you mentioned, you get that reference where he says, only he wasn't no colored man.
Right. This is down on the bottom of page 21.
Right. In a story by Jerry Conway and Don Heck.
Which involved, not too surprisingly, the Lord of Time.
Yeah, and edited by Len Wein. So there you go. So I guess I should. Well, I wouldn't have collected that issue probably until after Crisis. I was picking up random Justice League back issues off and on for a long time, but I don't think I had that one prior to the Crisis. So yeah, Batlash. Yeah, this is really my first sort of this and the Who's Who cover where he's tipping his hat to Big Bear. But I just love his character. I think he's funny. Funny and different. Why do I have this in my notes? It says the compendium lists Jonah Hex number 90, which I imagine you probably talked about in one of the Monitoring the Monitor episodes, as a pre-crisis appearance of the Monitor. The Monitor in disguise gives Jonah Hex a horse.
So he did. We don't see the Monitor. Well, we really have no explanation for who this old man is at all. He appears to be just a farmer. He calls over his shoulder for his wife to bring something out to Jonah, but we never actually see the wife. So he's just like this old farmer who gives Jonah a horse, and then there's this bright flash of light behind Jonah as he rides off. Jonah notices it, I think, but he's in too big a hurry to wonder about it more than that. So not only do we not see the Monitor in his true form, we don't see him go back to his satellite. We receive no real confirmation that it has been the Monitor at all. Just that something vaguely supernatural has occurred to help Jonah along the path of the adventure he's having at that moment.
Yeah. How far did you get up in your recap? I totally forget.
The first row of panels at the top of page 21, just as Nighthawk is leaving.
Oh, okay. So on page 20, do you have anything else for 19?
For 19? No, not really. Just we've talked about Batlash at length. Will he save the West or ruin it? That was actually his tagline.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of hilarious that Batlash says that he was contacted by telegram and that he had to come all the way out to Coyote. I mean, I can't imagine telegrams go too quickly at this time period. So the from the point when I guess someone discovers the fork to now, it just seems kind of funny to me, that this crisis event is happening. But there probably was little delivery of, hey, I don't know what this is, in another week, and then he has to go out to where it is. It just kind of seemed funny to me, but I don't know. And then I wrote here, just how long was the fork in town? Again, I mean, if he's supposed to say, oh, I found this fork, let me contact these people, there's got to be time passage. Yeah. So why didn't other people notice it? And then I just wrote, you just can't think about it too much in that way.
Yeah, it is out there in the wilderness. It would take, range riders like these, colorfully attired Western outsiders to come across it.
Yeah, and I did write, it does kind of look like desert buttes. It kind of looks like it's a good camouflage for the desert.
Yeah, if you look at it, the panel in the middle of page 20, there are sort of rock chimneys all around it, which sort of resemble it.
Let's see. For Scalp Hunter, they use his real name a lot as opposed to Scalp Hunter. It just makes me wonder if they were being a little bit sensitive about the name Scalp Hunter.
They probably had good reason to, although the character was less than 10 years old at this time. So,
yeah. In his history, he once arm wrestled Abraham Lincoln.
I did not know that.
So Abraham Lincoln died in 1865. So this is how many years later. And then later, of course, he is Brian Savage because, of course, he is a savage, quote unquote, right? And I wondered like as you mentioned, he's obviously wrapped up in a lot of Starman continuity. Nighthawk will come back with a bunch of Hawkman continuity. Jonah Hex obviously will live on as Hex in the future, which is something that will actually still be in play after the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But
we do see a quick glimpse of Hex's future as Hex in Crisis itself, don't we?
Yeah, mm-hmm. In the last issue, yep. Apparently, Johnny Thunder, there was a story that he meets somebody or one of his children marries a woman and or something where he has a kid named Chuck Tane, but it's kind of like a reference to Bouncing Boy, but not really. I don't know. It's kind of weird.
Right. Because we have Bouncing Boy's Chuck Tane and Johnny Thunder's real name is John Tane. It's not spelled the same, but of course there's 1,100 years time between the two of them. Plenty of time for the eye to enter the spelling of the name in that time.
Yeah. But my question about Scalp Hunter actually relates to, and we may not get to it for a while, so I'm going to throw it in here, to the history of the DC universe. There's an image of some Indian character looking into a cave of swirling light, and I never, ever, ever know who that's supposed to be.
This is that's Strongbow.
Oh,
yeah,
who the hell is Strongbow?
I think he might have been one of the characters that was involved in that historical character team up that we were talking about with Miss Liberty and Black Pirate and so forth. Strongbow, he was just an American Indian brave who was sort of an outsider to his own tribe, a pariah, and he just spent his life walking back and forth endlessly across the prairie. And at some point, he found this cave jutting out of the middle of an expansive prairie, which had swirling lights in it. And when he entered that cave, he could travel to other time periods. Just a device that the creators of that strip cooked up when they ran out of things to do with him in his own time period, I guess.
Huh. I just looked him up. He apparently has... Does he have a Who's Who entry? I mean...
Strongbow definitely does, yeah.
Oh, well, there's a character that completely fell right out of my attention while going through the Who's Who. That's interesting. Okay, well, there you go. Thank you for... As that one listener said, we even learn things from each other. That's awesome.
We salute you, Big John.
And then I wrote here, Johnny Thunder rides a horse named Black Lightning. Just saying.
Okay, it took me a minute.
Yeah. And then some of the Western comics, or really the war comics, Jonah Hex was still around more or less by this point.
He was about it, and
yeah.
He had just about reached the end of his ride also, because he would then jump into the future and cease to be a Western comic and become briefly a science fiction comic.
Yeah. And then that's it. That's all I have for 20. I do have some stuff for the top of 21. Do you have anything for 20?
I don't think. Well, I mentioned that the two sort of outsiders here, the ones that don't seem to know each other so much, would be Johnny Thunder and Nighthawk, and those are, as I mentioned, that they're older DC Comics Western characters dating back to, they were both created in 1948. So, and as I also said, they hadn't been used by more recent creators quite as much, deemed sort of artifacts of another time, which is ironic because the entire Western genre is about reconnecting to another time. So, but anyway, this is all about building bridges between past, present, and future. So it's nice that we've got recently created 19th century characters and older 19th century characters reuniting for this particular story.
Yeah.
And then to the top of page 21. Actually, one more thing. At bottom of page 20, Scalp Hunter remarks that he was with Nighthawk when they found this machine. And I don't think there's been any mention made of those two characters teaming up in the past. In fact, this is the first time Nighthawk has appeared anywhere since 1959.
Wow.
So that's 26 years without a single peep from Nighthawk. And here we're told that he and the much more recently introduced Scalp Hunter have had some kind of adventure together, at the end of which they found this tower. So there's another untold crisis tale for you.
And it is kind of cool that out of all of them, Nighthawk is the one that seems the most along the lines of like a mystery man prior to what the concept even of mystery man, because he has a domino mask and he has the emblem on his chest,
the black outfit. I think they're going for like the Batman figure of the group.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. I mean, because all the rest of them you could sort of say are just in what they would most likely wear at that time, even though they have a sort of iconic look. You're not going to see Jonah Hex outside of his Confederate. Is it Confederate? Yeah, his Confederate uniform. And Batlash is always with the white jacket and the yellow vest. So that's kind of cool. I thought that was an interesting thing. I love the first three panels, especially of the top of page 21. They're broken up into panels, but yet there's still a sense of movement and.
Right, the first three in particular it's really just one panel broken into three.
Mm-hmm. And it's all about the conversation and all that. I read, because I had a note here and I was wondering, okay, why are these panels, the actual panel themselves design, why are they all rounded? And I read just today, as I was looking for a fun fact, this is not my fun fact, but it also was in the same article. Perez specifically drew the panels in this sequence to emulate the way the panels were designed or were the way they were created for Batlash comics. Apparently, they were more rounded at that time.
Interesting.
So
to imitate the appearance of photographs in a rotogravure.
I mean, could be.
There.
For us, it's shorthand language. Usually, it means
flashback.
Like a flashback. But well, I guess this is a flashback.
Right, to 1879. Yeah.
Yeah. But we made notice of that with the anthro sequence, because he even said, when I did the anthro sequence in the top of issue 2, I did it with very jagged edges and just to create something different. And he said he did it here as well. So I thought that was interesting.
It's very good attention to detail, I must say.
Yeah. And then the other thing I have here, again, speaking to that whole outworld presence, or metatextual presence, your names suddenly came to us as if we were told to summon you. Of course you were told, because the Wolfman needed you to gather you together. So, I mean, maybe it was the Monitor, but still.
That's kind of the way I read it.
Yeah. And it also, I have here in my notes, it's kind of like the DC universe in the way that Morrison always talks about, where he wants to make it almost sentient, and it kind of almost is, if you think about it. It's like the DC. You could look at it as the DC universe, wanting to bring its characters together in a way to protect itself.
Right.
Almost like generating, giving them more knowledge than they would normally have to sort of say, hey, we have to bring them together.
It's gathering all of its antibodies at the site of the infection.
Yeah, there you go. Love it. That's so Morrison. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. What did I write here? I wrote, it almost the whole comic book conceit that people just think things or told or sense. It's the writer. It's the DC universe for expediency, but also not wanting to have to explain it. We accept it. Hell, the characters accept it because Coyote Gospel. And now that's some real hypercrisis connectivity here. And I need to stop connecting all my Animal Man and Morrison comics.
This is set in Coyote, Texas. Ah!
Oh, God, no! You just blew my mind. See? It really does. It really is all connected. Oh, that's crazy. I got chills on that, Mert. I love it. All right. That's all the notes I had for that. Anyway.
All right. Let's rejoin the posse down here on page 21 as the Western characters are powwowing down at the base of the tower, and then down from the top of the tower come the heroes of the 20th century. They come jumping down. Cyborg has a wisecrack at the ready. He says, "This ain't no place for John Wayne rejects." Simon has a wise crack of his own. How droll, cowboys and Indians together. Although technically, Kebo Note is not really an American Indian. He's a white man who was raised by Plains Indians. But that's neither here nor there. They all come jumping down. I think it's Batlash who shouts, "Holy spooks!" And we can just tastefully overlook the fact that 2 of the 4 characters he's pointing his gun at are African-American. And then we move on to the next panel where Bat opens fire, but Hex is the one who realizes, I recognize a couple of these cowpokes. Firebrand of Earth 2 tries to calm them down. "We won't hurt you. My name's Firebrand." And then we get to the panel you were mentioning earlier, Peter, when Hex is talking to Batlash and says, "Don't you remember the green costume on that hombre? It's the same one we saw on another guy who called himself a lantern or something. Only he wasn't no colored man." So, as you said, and as Chuck Coletta also says in his note, this is a reference to Justice League of America, Volume 1, numbers 198 and 199 from the late 1981. A team-up of Western characters with the JLA, and it was Hal Jordan at that time, because John Stewart then explains to Hex, "I've replaced that other Green Lantern." And then Batlash plays up to Firebrand immediately. Then John Thunder gets something to say. If you are not spirits, who are you? And Firebrand explains that they've been sent from another time to save our world, which is a little funny because she's the only one. Again, it's the Earth 1, Earth 2 thing. Firebrand is technically from Earth 2, so it's not she can't use the first-person possessive there because our worlds would be more accurate. We're assuming we're still on Earth 1. Since, again, if Earth 2 gets all those Golden Age superheroes, Earth 1 gets the Golden Age, well, the 1940s set war comics and presumably the Old West comics, too. So, again, this is another controversy to debate in the future. But by our world, I guess he just means Earth, whichever vibratory version of Earth you happen to inhabit. Meanwhile, from the shadows, pairs of sinister eyes are watching. And then out pop the shadow demons, going to the top of page 22. Firebrand says, we can explain things another time. We've got our work cut out for us now. And then Scalp Hunter says, there are our demons, Batlash. Stuff to say about that page 21 in the first panel of 22.
Oh, I got lots to say. Do you got stuff to say?
I may, but you go first.
Okay. First of all, Cyborg is a little bit of a dick in this. I mean, he comes out screaming, you guys better join him. This ain't no place for John Wayne rejects.
Yeah, trying to scare them all off.
Right. Not that they know who John Wayne is. And then Simon is just sort of making a comment, how droll, cowboys and Indians together. And Cyborg is like, shut up, Simon, we got work here. I'm like, excuse me, Cyborg, you just had a dig at them. And then Simon is just sort of making a comment, and you're like jumping on his back. I thought that was a little weird.
Well, remember, this is Cyborg and Simon. They've fought each other before. So he's probably not, Cyborg's probably not in much of a mood to take any lip from that particular character.
Yeah, I just thought it was weird right after saying what he said. I thought that was I don't know why. It's kind of, maybe this is the old. Maybe the only reason it sort of stuck out is because, I don't know, maybe I'm sort of used to hearing Cyborg in some way, and his tensions are high, definitely. I can understand that, but it just struck me as just a little, Simon's just making an observation. It is condescending, but Cyborg, you did make a joke that your fellow compatriots will know. I don't know. It just kind of stuck in my brain. And then I wrote, where did they actually appear from? Of course, they're probably like spirits, because if they're in a mine, it's, they're flying out of where? They're coming from. How tall is this mine that they're flying down from?
Yeah, and how, for that matter, because it seems to be emerging like straight out of solid rock.
Right? And if you look at the next page, the one, where you covered, it does look like the top of the ceiling is also rock as well, to some degree.
It's just occurred to me, maybe these four have been Scooby-Dooing this whole time and have been scaring any other denizens of 1879 away from the tower when they came too close.
That's funny. So, like we did for the other eras, why these particular characters, why bring them here, or why group them together? And I have a outlandish idea of why these four are put together.
The more outlandish, the better, Peter. Share, please.
So we have Simon, who's a brain, Firebrand, who's a torch, Green Lantern, who can make semi-visible constructs and bubbles and such, and Cyborg, who is the deformed, wants-to-be-human strongman. Who does that sound like?
It's clobbering time.
It's the Fantastic Four.
Does that mean Cyborg's going to dress up like a pirate before they leave?
Probably. Come on, isn't that, that's not, obviously that's not Monitor sending them there, but Wolfman, somebody had to thought of that. If not, that is a weird coincidence.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah. I just thought that was interesting. I was like, oh my God, it's the Fantastic Four. And I did but I do think it's interesting. Now here a little more story purpose. That the Monitor sends back 2 African American and a woman to the Wild West, and a woman with powers, and I wondered if that had anything to do with anything. Probably not, but
Yes, and a frail intellectual type as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, the real men of the West don't cotton to no robe-wearing brain boys.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, who else, why would you send just a bunch of white guys there when there are already a bunch of white guys there? So why not mix it up a little bit? So I thought that was kind of fun. But I still love my Fantastic Four thing. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, the more I look at that picture of Firebrand streaking down, trailing flames behind her, I think I see what you see.
Yeah. I just thought that was funny. And then the only other thing is, you stopped at the top of page 22. That first panel could more or less be the reference image used for the cover. So the cover is all divided up into all these heroic eras, and or two of the heroic eras, and Earth 1 present and Earth 1 future. And if you look at the grouping on the cover of all the heroes, it kind of looks like they're, charging towards something. So it kind of reminds me a little bit like that image. Although there are no horses there at that point.
Right. Whereas on the cover, everybody, well, all the Westerners anyway, are on horses.
Yeah. So, all right, that's all I had.
All right, then, let's rejoin the battle. All right, so Simon is there. We get a close-up of, just his head, really, enveloped in a corona of psionic energy, as he says, "Stand aside, you simple poltroons. Mine is the power of psionics. I need only think, and my very thoughts become reality." And then, after that's set up, he finds that his powers aren't working on the shadow demons. And then we get Cyborg, mouthing off to him again, because, as leader of the Fearsome Five, Simon has mixed it up with the new Teen Titans a few times, and Cyborg's not a fan of him. He yells, "Move it, Globe Dome, fast! Firebrand, behind you!" And then we get a panel. This is one panel that I think is actually improved by the recoloring of the hardcover.
Yeah, because it's way confusing.
Yeah, you can't make out anything there. You can see that something is shattering, and then there's some kind of image overlaid on it in pink. But you can make out much better in the hardcover that Simon's. The implication is Simon's brain globe has been shattered by the shadow demons, and it's kind of a heavily stylized depiction of Simon's death, which would probably otherwise be pretty graphic and gross. They wouldn't shy away from just showing that happening today, but in 1986 they still had a little bit of taste. Or 1985, I should say. Firebrand discovers that she can use her firepower to destroy the shadow demons, so their vulnerabilities are becoming... They're still a little bit vague, but it's becoming more and more apparent that if you use the right kind of elemental energy against them, they'll just shatter. The Western heroes do the only thing they know how to do and start shooting, get those 6 guns blazing. It's not doing a lick of good. Then in comes Cyborg with his white sound, 1,000,000 decibels of white sound. Correct me, is it usually that same amount every time, Peter?
Yeah, I think so.
When Cyborg brags on his white sound powers, it's 1,000,000 decibels. And sure enough, that's effective. Meanwhile, John Stewart is trying to use his own brand of energy against the shadow demons. And he muses to himself, "Man, the Guardians knew what they were doing when they put together this baby," name-dropping the source of a Green Lantern's power. "But," says a caption, "the ring does not work." Stewart is agog. He says it still has a half-day's charge, but the ring isn't working. So, uh-oh. And at that point, on the top of page 23, the ex-Confederate soldier, Jonah Hex, has to jump in and save John Stewart's life. Knocks him aside and says, "Move it, mister, lest you got yourself a bad death wish." He was always drunk. His dialogue is always... He has the thickest accent. And he's... From his... I'm trying to remember back to his first appearance in, what was it, All-Star Western number 70-something. It was in 1969, I'm pretty sure. And I'm trying to remember if he always spoke with that kind of a really exaggerated drawl, but... more so than a lot of other Western characters, including in this story. That's the difference between Hex and the others. His accent is much thicker than any of the other Western characters in this issue. But he rescues John Stewart from death by Shadow Demon. Then Firebrand notices it. Odd that she's the one to notice it, but she hears a high-pitched whine. the source of which is not immediately clear. But then Johnny Thunder remarks the minds observes the minds caving in. So in the middle of their battle with the shadow demons, that happens. And I think we'll cut short there because there'll be some things to say about Nighthawk later on. But okay, so this part of the fight, Peter, comments.
Okay. Again, it sort of seems like the characters fare a little better fighting the shadow demons than they did in issue 1. Not only fighting them, but destroying them. I love the panel with all the Western heroes with their backs against the wall, just shooting. And you can see Batlash's hat. It's at the bottom there of page 22, the second panel. His hat is kind of tipped because if he was against the wall, the back of the hat would pitch forward, just a little bit of attention to detail of how, they all would kind of group together and battle and do the best they can with just shooting guns.
Yeah, that panel's got kind of a Dutch tilt to it, too.
Yeah.
Also cool.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of that little bit of storytelling. We know why Green Lantern's ring isn't working because of the sequence in... Was it this issue? Earlier?
Oh, no, it wasn't this issue.
It was issue 2. Of
the Guardians on Oa who run afoul of here we go. It is issue 2, page 13.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. No, Guardians, it is too late. You shall no more summon your soldiers than prove a threat to my plans. What began with you many centuries ago ends with you now. Scrah! And then there's a bunch of unconscious, prone Guardians littering the floor of the main battery chamber.
So you can sort of say, okay, well, time has no meaning in this story to some degree, so it's kind of hard to say. Even though that happened in issue 2, and we've seen the shadow of the Anti-Monitor since then, we know that this takes place later, but it could have happened at the same time. Or maybe it just took that long for his power ring to be affected by what happened on Oa. Or maybe because of time dilation, the 24 hours was just up. It's kind of hard to say what really happened, but I have to assume it's connected back to that Oa sequence.
Oh, I'm quite sure.
Yeah.
Yep, because he was using it just fine a few minutes ago.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Look at the stance he's using there in the second to last panel on 22. Is that reminiscent of Neil Adams to you?
A little bit. Yeah, I can see that. Do you have a particular cover in mind or image?
Not really.
No.
Or at least not consciously.
Right. Perez, I wouldn't put him past it to, if he's using panel borders that are reminiscent of an old Batlash comic, I have to imagine he's definitely using shorthand of other characters, to try to make them look at least a little familiar to our eyes. Especially ones that he hasn't drawn a lot. You know what I mean? It's one thing for him to know how to draw the Titans. He's going to know how to draw the Outsiders. He drew them a couple times. But when it comes to these other characters, he's like, I'm sure he probably said, Sergeant Rock. Let me look at some Joe Kubert Sergeant Rock imagery and let me see what's going on here. So that's a good observation. Now, to that panel, it certainly doesn't look the same as when the Monitor zaps away Solivar or Blue Beetle. It kind of looks like maybe he's destroying. I know what you said about it looks like his glass encasing is exploding. Is it a shadow demon exploding? Is it? The obvious thought is, okay, this is when Brainiac and Luthor are collecting villains, because we don't see Simon anymore after this.
Well, we do eventually.
I meant in Wild West.
Oh yeah,
the Wild West sequence.
Not in this issue, not in this sequence, right?
Yeah, and not in, I looked ahead, not in that issue. So that's a confusing panel for me. It's always been a confusing panel, like what actually happened here? Because if if his brain encasing did explode, Luthor and Brainiac capturing him, would they take the time to fix his brain? I think that's too much of a leap. So I don't know if it's more of they're just pulling him out of existence, but why would they know he was back here in the Wild West? It's so confusing. I'm not sure what that panel means, and we don't see him again in the Wild West sequence, so it's a little confusing.
Yeah, the underlying meaning is, as you say, not at all clear. But I think we're supposed to just assume for the moment that I think what Wolfman wants us to assume is that Simon's been killed.
Right.
Yes. And this is a character that Wolfman created, after all. So him, ostensibly killing off said character here is maybe to take that as a gesture of good faith towards other creators, as was also the case with his character Cole, whom he created specifically for the purpose of killing one of his own creations in this story he's telling. Just to show everyone else, hey, look, see, I'm playing fair. I'm killing my own characters too. Please don't take this personally when this story kills some of your characters as well.
Yeah. And then about the high-pitched whine on page 23, the annotations say that it's the machine starting up. But again, I know you can mess around with time, but in reading this chronologically, Monitor hasn't activated the machines yet. He hasn't activated his plan yet. So, and in terms of us reading it, now that doesn't mean that he can't have hit it next issue, started up next issue, and it affects backwards in time. But so I'm not sure what that means. Is it the mind caving? Is it just nature screaming? Is it the fork? I'm not sure.
And why is Firebrand the one to hear it?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a little bit, it's a little bit unclear, but it doesn't speak to the larger story, so that's okay. And I think, is that where you stopped?
That is.
Yeah, okay.
All right, now let's just take a quick look here at the rest of page 23. Then there's a pretty big jump in setting. But we return to Nighthawk, who's missed this whole fight sequence because he left just as the 4 20th century heroes descended to go get some more weapons. But he's out there, he's trying to wrangle his horse Nightwind, and he looks around and he says, uh-oh, look at that. Ain't never seen nothing like that. What in blazes is going on? And the next panel is just showing what he sees, which is the red skies, the lightning bolts, and the growing white spot in the sky. And he jumps on Nightwind and rides off, saying, everything's going crazy. It's got to be that metal machine's fault. Never did trust mechanical things. And then he sees that white spot in the sky is a little more dangerous than he originally thought because it is consuming, just destroying the entire town of Coyote, Texas, nearby. He sees the destruction it's wreaking, the death it's causing, and this is I think I picked up my copy of issue number 3. I think before I was able to get my hands on a copy of issue number 1. So I didn't read it. I didn't allow myself to read it because I didn't want to read the story out of order. And I didn't have to wait long because I did eventually find a copy of number 1 and was able to read things properly. But I did at least flip through this issue, and I saw this scene. And I just Nighthawk, he's talking to himself in this sort of affected, latter 20th century interpretation of Wild West dialogue. And then he sees this great wall of white matter coming at him, and he's seized by mortal terror. He doesn't say, like, great horny toads, or whatever you might expect a Western cliched cowboy to say. He says, oh, God! Oh, my God! Like, suddenly he's talking like a normal human being. Well, normal from, the contemporary point of view, of course. And he's just expressing stark fear at what he's seeing, more than just, consternation or... He's suddenly his experience is rendered universal, and there's this sudden stark connection between a modern day reader and the experience of this 19th century character that might be nothing more than just like a figure of comedy. Just a costumed cowboy in 1985 would seem a little bit silly, but then you realize, oh yeah, costumed cowboys can fear death too, when it comes bearing down on you in the form of this huge, implacable white wall of antimatter. And then there are narrative captions that say, it's an emptiness, white, silent, sweeping across the Texas plains with the swiftness of the Santa Ana winds. It's an emptiness that swallows all it touches. Nothing escapes. Nothing and nobody. And we get these 4 panels down there just creating this little sort of frame around this tiny little square cell in the middle of Nighthawk on his horse, galloping at top speed for his life, as other humans and animals of the town of Coyote perish in the white antimatter. We see an image of Mrs. Gofui and her pretty daughter dying down there in the lower right of that little 4-panel set. And then we see Nightwind bucking, tossing Nighthawk off its back. In desperation, he draws his gun, fires at it, just crushing, chilling futility of this cowboy character lying there as if firing a gun at fate itself, and then in the very last panel, dying, just being wiped out of existence, unmade right before our eyes. Metatextually speaking, you can see that as his coming to face to terrifying face with his own obsolescence. The fact that costumed cowboy characters have no place in the entertainment world of 1985, and instead of just disappearing from the scene, he is forcibly eradicated from the scene by this wall of antimatter. And it's that scene that, as I said, I paged through this comic and saw this before I got a chance to read the story from the beginning. And man, quite a taste of things to come that was for me. It stuck with me, and it still does to this day.
And it speaks to the power of, Wolfman's writing or the weight of this series in general, that it's such a one-off character, a character, like you said, that hadn't appeared for decades. And yet if we can be affected by Superwoman being eaten by the wall, and now Nighthawk, and we haven't even gotten to the biggies yet, so it's great storytelling. It has a weight to it and an importance to it that later events never really sort of capture again. I don't want to speak generally, but the dying in an event became cliche after a while.
Especially when those deaths proved to be as frustratingly impermanent as they tended to be.
Yeah. But these deaths, as we've been saying multiple times, we don't know. That's why these characters are literally being erased. They're becoming blank slates. We don't know if we'll ever see them again. And they're not being destroyed or they're not shattering or exploding. They're just simply, as Sergeant Rock said, disappearing. And that's kind of cool. Yeah, but not cool, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
It's darkly fascinating, shall we say. Yeah, and it's a painful disappearance, too, because every time you see a character vanishing into the antimatter, they're screaming in agony as they go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, well, so a couple of things I have about the death of Nighthawk sequence. Well, again, to give a little extra praise to Wolfman here, I love the sentence, sweeping across the Texas plains with the swiftness of the Santa Ana winds, just evocative of the purple prose of the Western, like, dime novel writers. I mean, he's wiping out these costumed cowboys, but at least he's doing it literally in their own terms, using phraseology that writers of these characters might have used back in their long-gone heyday. This is something that I have to give credit to John Woodward's Annotated Crisis website for. The 5th panel, as Nighthawk is galloping away and talking aloud, blaming that metal machine for what he sees happening. And he says, "Never did trust mechanical things," which is not something that Nighthawk would say, because part of his backstory is that in his secret identity as Hannibal Hawks, he worked as a traveling fix-it man. He had a junk wagon, basically. He went from town to town fixing people's gadgets and gizmos and repairing their brooms or shoeing horses, whatever kind of work he could get. So he is a character who would not distrust mechanical things at all because he made a living by them. So just whether Wolfman wasn't aware of that or whether he just had such a low opinion of Nighthawk as a character, he wanted to go out of his way to write him out of character in his final moments. Who can say? And speaking of Wolfman, that's another point I wanted to make. We must have mentioned by now that one agreement that Wolfman reached with himself as he set out to write this series was that he promised he would not, just as a gesture of respect to his elders, so to speak, he would not kill any characters in Crisis that had been created before he was born. Right? And so this one, Marv Wolfman is actually going to be celebrating his 70th birthday next week as we record this. It is May 5th, 2016, and he is just a little over a week away, I think, from his 70th birthday. He was born in 1946. Nighthawk was created in late 1948. So he's just making it in there. He's got to be, if you don't count the Earth 2 Green Arrow, who buys it much later in the series. And I guess we can excuse Wolfman from his promise to himself there because he's only killing a Green Arrow. He's not killing the Green Arrow that matters most. You can make that argument, I guess. But next to that, I think Nighthawk is the oldest character that Wolfman sees fit to kill off in this series. Introduced in the pages of Western Comics. That was literally the title, Western Comics, in late 1948.
Interesting. That's a good fact. I like that.
Yeah. He wasn't exactly obscure in the 50s either. He was pretty prominent. He had a long run in the Western Comics series for a long time, but that, as I said before, that ended in 1959, and nobody used the character since then. So
yeah. Well, we can go up to him next time we see Marv Wolfman and say, "You lied."
What about Green Arrow, you mean?
What about, Nighthawk, about Nighthawk.
Well, no, he wasn't going to kill characters that were created before he was born.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. You're right.
He was born in 46, and Nighthawk was 48. So he's still safe. He's good on his word to himself with that. But I might ask him, what do you got against Nighthawk, hombre?
Or Green Arrow?
Draw owl hoot. No, Green Arrow's a different. We'll get to that when we talk about the issue in which Green Arrow of Earth 2 actually dies. But,
right, okay.
But, yeah, I think he probably had his reasons, and it may have been something that an editor requested that he do.
Yeah, because, out of all of them, Johnny Thunder is the one you think would be the most expendable because there's already, so many other Johnny Thunders.
True.
Why Nighthawk?
Yes, and Johnny Thunder, he predated Nighthawk by only a few months. I'm pretty sure they were both introduced in the same year, that year of 1948, which is kind of when Westerns took over. Besides a few isolated pockets of superhero adventures at DC National, Westerns became like the premier, the most prominent genre. All-Star Comics became All-Star Western, All-American Comics became All-American Western, and they also introduced the Western Comics series during that year. But it is a good point that Johnny Thunder would seem to be a natural thing because of the other Johnny Thunder characters, both the Johnny Thunder of Earth 1 and Roy Thomas's female Private Eye Johnny Thunder as well. Yeah. But he still, maybe it's because he didn't wear a mask. Maybe the bird logo and the mask on his face made him seem that much quainter, more like the blue sequin cowboys of the like the Roy Rogers and Gene Autry era.
Maybe he did it because Marvel has a Nighthawk character.
Huh. Interesting notion.
Got to get rid of our duplicates from another company.
Yeah. Although DC was never one to shy away from taking little pokes at the competition's characters. Remember, Marvel's Nighthawk was just a doppelganger of Batman.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know why. But like I said, that's one thing I might actually ask Marv Wolfman if I ever get the guts to talk to him one of these days. I had the opportunity to moderate a panel with Marv Wolfman over at the London Super Comic Convention.
Oh.
But I did not have the guts to do that.
Well, his stock answer is always, that was a long time ago. Crisis fried my brain. I don't have any idea. Well, that's probably what he'll say.
Writing a thesis about Crisis fried my brain, so I'd have no choice but to accept that excuse from him, I'm afraid.
I did like how at the start of this Wild West sequence, if you notice the skies, they're all blue. There's no hint of the Crisis. And when Nighthawk leaves, there's clearly red skies, electrical storms,
Mm-hmm.
Basically going from light to dark. And to add to what you said about Wolfman and his purple prose, George Perez has visual shorthands whenever he wants to show terror. And if you notice, Nighthawk's eyes are completely wide open, all white with just the little black dots, in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you look in previous pages, it's not quite that way. And he used that rounded eye thing either to show innocence, like with Starfire and Changeling, or sheer terror.
Well, yeah, Mortal Fear does have a way of
Okay, sorry.
bringing back little childlike emotions, like
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. The only thing I have to say, is kind of like with the losers. Whenever one of these characters die with the wall, we have to assume that once the Earth is put back together, that either they have a new death or maybe they just die of old age. But it would be kind of interesting. I mean, we know eventually what's going to happen with Nighthawk when it comes to James Robinson's Hawkman series.
Right.
Being all put in. Was it James Robinson Hawkman or was it Zero Hour? No.
Well, it was Zero Hour that introduced the idea that Nighthawk was a bearer of the Hawk avatar, but it was a completely different concept. And it wasn't so much that he was a past life of Carter Hall / Prince Khufu.
Right.
It was just that he was because this was when Bill Messner-Loebs was writing the book in the 90s, and he had this whole idea of animal avatars, and the lead character there was still Qatar Hall of Thanagar.
Right.
So that's how we tied Nighthawk into this idea of an eternal Hawk champion. But I think it wasn't until like Johns and Robinson that we were told that Hannibal Hawks, a.k.a. Nighthawk, was a reincarnation of Khufu, and it was part of the same succession of reincarnations that included Carter Hall.
Yeah. Which I always loved that concept. So, but I mean, until then, it kind of makes you wonder, whatever did happen to Nighthawk post-crisis, if the universe has to be put back together again.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, as you say, eventually a Times Past story does fill us in on the details and lets us know that there's actually a romance between Nighthawk and his fellow DC Western character Cinnamon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So last 2 pages.
All right. So we spend a little bit of time in the 30th century here on page 24. Metropolis, the 30th century. Well, fresh in my mind here, since you just mentioned the coloration of the skies on page 23, how it's gone from blue to that pinkish red color that's so closely associated with Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Page 24, the color of the sky in the 30th century is yellow. But in the recolored hardcover, though, it is changed to that same reddish hue. So I think that's another improvement that the repackaging of the hardcover made. The emptiness is there too in the 30th century, says a caption. A silent killer moving in to claim this world, and not even the Legion of Superheroes can stop it. So there's your introduction. We have a group of 4 Legionnaires: Wildfire, Cosmic Boy, Lightning Lass, and Sun Boy. The same 4 that we see on the front cover. Plus Brainiac 5 and Dream Girl. They're in the very next panel there. They're all using their respective energy powers on the white wall, and it's not working, so they radio into Legion HQ, where Brainiac 5 and Dream Girl are waiting. You can see the chest logos of a few different Legionnaires, namely the ones that are on the scene trying to fight the White Wall on a monitor bank behind Brainiac 5's head. Dream Girl is berating herself for having not foreseen any of this, wondering why her precognitive abilities didn't alert her that a disaster of this magnitude was going to happen. Then Brainiac 5 radios in to, he presses a button on a row of buttons with different Legionnaire logos on them. He radios into minor Legion of Superheroes supporting character Kid Psycho, who is active in 30th century London, trying to fight off this same encroaching wall of antimatter. And he wants to know where his backup is, where the rest of the Legion is. He wonders futilely, even if we could clear out the city in time, where in blazes can we put the people? And then we jump to yet another scene where Mon-El and Element Lad are trying to evacuate a bunch of people. Those two are in communication with Brainiac 5 as well. We learn that Brainiac 5 can't contact Kid Psycho in London. Something's interfering with radio communication. Element Lad tries to get to him too, to Kid Psycho, but a wall of crumbles next to him, knocks him out, knocks him to the ground. And as Element Lad screams desperately for Kid Psycho to come in, blast it, come in, the wall of antimatter claims yet another victim as the unconscious, well, at least Kid Psycho feels no pain. All right. Stuff to say about this page, Peter.
Well, we're 3 issues in, and the Legion has now had 3 major scenes, if not more than that. It's kind of interesting how much time they're actually getting. If you think about, I know we're focusing on Earth 1 right now, and that is the future of Earth 1, the Legion of Superheroes era. But in terms of DC's publishing shelf space the titles that they're publishing, you got present day Earth 1, you got the Legion of Superheroes. They had 2 titles out at this point, but you also had the Earth 2, Infinity Inc. and All Star Squadron. So it makes you wonder, why aren't they getting as much screen time as the Legion are?
I think it's probably just the Earth 1 bias you just mentioned, Peter.
Yeah.
The other Earths will have their time in the sun a little later on.
Yeah. I love Perez's attention to detail on all the powers of the Legion of Superheroes on that second panel there. They're all basically different. Cosmic Boy with his ringlets, Lightning Lass with her lightning powers are different from Wildfire's, they're slightly different from Sun Boy's. That's some great attention to detail right there. And Kid Psycho, he's the sacrifice for the Legion of Superheroes. I don't believe there's any other Legion member that dies, but I could be wrong. It's just maybe me not remembering.
No, I think you're right there, Peter. I think he's the only representative of the Legion. And
which is kind of lame, if you think of it, because the Legion has a ton of characters and side characters. And
yeah, they could certainly spare a few more than this one, but just to see that as sort of a microcosm for the relatively small impact that the Crisis event had on Legion continuity as a whole, at least immediately. I mean, eventually people tumbled to the fact that, there's no Superboy. That kind of removes the foundation stone and topples the entire timeline that the Legion occupies. But at first, the Legion just kind of went on in business as usual for a year or two after Crisis ended.
Yeah, and I mean, if you didn't know what Byrne's plan was, or Wolfman's plan, I should say Byrne, if you didn't know what his plans were for Superman, you didn't know that there was not going to be a Superboy anymore. We didn't know that at this point,
Sure you didn't.
Yeah, so, it's kind of a little bit of a cheat. How many Earth 2 characters died? How many, well, definitely Earth 1, Could have spared 1 or 2 more. I mean, did we, arm fall off boy wasn't good enough?
I'm not sure why they picked on poor Kid Psycho here.
I know.
But, I'm going to offer a bit of a eulogy for him here, but, not a eulogy so much as just an obituary.
Okay.
Because I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who have never known a thing about Kid Psycho other than the fact that he died in this issue of Crisis. And that he
Me
was
included.
kind of a Legionnaire. So I dug out my copy of Who's Who in the Legion #3, and I learned a few basic facts about Kid Psycho. Okay, so his real name, I'm not going by notes here, this is all in my head. Gnil Oprel of the planet Hajor. That's his real name. Okay, so he's not from Earth. His parents were astronauts who were zapped by some kind of space creature, and as a result of that strange radiation, their eventually born son, Gnil, was born with an abnormally large cranium. So he's got a large head underneath that turban. It's not just the shape of the hat, it's the shape of his head. And strange blank eyes, and the ability to create psionic force shields. Shortly after his birth, well, maybe not sure, I shouldn't say that. I think he was like a young teenager. A rogue asteroid destroyed his planet. So he and his parents moved to Earth, and he applied for Legion membership. But what he didn't realize about his powers, but the Legion did, was that every time he used his power to generate these force shields, he was shaving about a year off of his lifespan. So his powers were slowly killing him. So the Legionnaires rejected him for membership for this reason, and he didn't understand why they were doing this. They assumed he knew about this weakness of his, this terrible detriment that his powers posed, but he did not know. He didn't know that his powers were killing him. So he went back in time, made friends with Superboy, and got him to sponsor him for membership. Then, finally, the Legionnaires revealed to him, these powers of yours are killing you, right? But he still volunteered bravely to serve as like an emergency reservist for the Legion. And emergencies don't come bigger than Crisis on Infinite Earths. So, of course, he was activated here. And so he falls in action. But so I guess the tragedy of his death is mitigated somewhat when we realize that every time he used his powers, he was coming closer to death anyway. So, so it's his dying here is not such a tragedy as it might otherwise be. But I looked up his first appearance. It was Superboy number 125 from 1965. The creative team was Otto Binder and George Papp, the same creators who gave me my beloved Bizarro and in Superboy 68. And the title of that story, there's a cover blurb that says, "Note to Superboy, do not envy Kid Psycho. You'll cheer, you'll cry when you read The Sacrifice of Kid Psycho." That was the title of his first appearance. And now it took 20 years, but that sacrifice is finally realized.
Yeah.
So, rest in peace, Gnil Oprel.
When you see his name spelled out, I'm like, that has got to be an anagram of something. Or I mean, when you read it backwards, it's LARPling, but it's like, what? That name is just weird.
LARPling.
Yeah, it looks like somebody just took somebody's name and spelled it backwards.
Okay, so this is GNILL space OPRAL. So
right.
Go to work, Crisis Kids. See what you can unscramble out of that.
Well, I did put it into an anagram server, but nothing really fun came out, other than like lap rolling or, nothing else really kind of stuck out.
I think LARPling is funny enough, actually.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't mean anything. He's just a Legion LARPer.
Yeah.
And he paid the price.
But that's all I had for that.
All right, let me throw in a final thought from Chuck Coletta here, which reflects back on the whole issue, really, and kind of a concern for the whole series, potentially. But anyway, so it's about the characters that are killed off in this issue. And Chuck writes, "I think the issue may have been somewhat more effective if some of the deaths had been more significant. For example, the Legion's Kid Psycho was about as insignificant a member of that team as you could imagine. Although he'd been around for about 20 years, this was the first time he was actually shown doing any adventuring." And Chuck's right about that. I looked it up. He's appeared... he had made 4 appearances prior to this. His first appearance, Legion number 200 and Legion number 300, which were anniversary issues with a lot of crowd scenes, bring in like a bunch of obscure members just for the anniversary, and 1 issue of like Secrets of the Legion of Superheroes. So that was it. Flower, who was also known as Farm Boy, says Chuck, from Easy Company, could have easily switched with the more prominent Bulldozer or Wildman. Wolfman and Perez weren't willing to bump off any of the already established Titans either. Cole was created to die, but I don't think her death really ever resonated with readers as intended. Maybe if they had even killed one of the Titans West members, that would have had some more impact. Perhaps killing off the more obscure heroes was a ploy to lull the reader into thinking that nobody really important would perish. And I think that last sentence there is a really good thought. So what I would agree that is one potential explanation for why we're given just some penny ante deaths, as it were, here in the early going. Then again, they're kind of building up to the more significant character deaths that we will see later on.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I quite agree with Chuck here that the deaths of these insignificant minor characters are not effective or affecting, because honestly, I find the deaths of these small characters, these expendable characters, even more chilling and affecting than the deaths of the major ones. Plenty of people are going to mourn for those big characters. They've made their impact. But seeing the little guys like Flower or Nighthawk or Kid Psycho by the farm in this story, it's a lot easier for me, as a little guy in the the real world, to identify with what must be going through the heads of these also-ran characters as they're unwritten than it is for me to identify with someone like Supergirl or The Flash.
Mm.
So that's my own thought about the deaths of the minor characters. I think it is more poignant, I think, in a way, than the deaths of the better known and more popular characters are. At least for someone like me, who always tends to sympathize with the underdogs and the also-rans of the world, whether it be my world or a fictional world like the DC universe.
Yeah, and you can't take away that scene. Reading that scene with the losers, buying it, was certainly powerful. I mean, I didn't know quite who they were, and if at the very least, it just made me go, "Oh my God, who are they?" Now I have to know who they are. So, I guess it depends on your familiarity, maybe with. I certainly could tell that Kid Psycho was not necessarily a strong player, but I don't know anything at that time about where Nighthawk stood. They all were Western characters, but was one more important than the other? Sure, I'm sure Jonah Hex was, but I didn't know about the other ones.
He still had an ongoing series at DC as of 1985.
Yeah. So.
Yep. And of course, we have to remember too. This is the first time a story of this kind had ever been told. This big universe-wide crossover in which deaths nowadays are expected. So nowadays, if a character of the minor magnitude of Kid Psycho was killed off, we just kind of roll our eyes derisively and say, cannon fodder.
Right.
But maybe not so much in 1985.
Well, and also, some of these minor characters get more screen time in their deaths than a lot of the characters that die in issue 12 that are much more major than these characters.
Right, just the series is ending. Let's toss a few more characters off stage at the last possible minute.
Yeah.
That is a good point also.
All right, last page.
All right, here we go, page 25. All right, so the left-hand side is a row of panels to be read vertically, as the monitor is standing in front of a large bank of monitors, like widescreen things about as larger than his own body, stacked one atop the other. It appears everywhere now, in every time period. Top monitor, ancient Atlantis. Second monitor, on every Earth. And then another caption that says the Old West. Third monitor, nothing is spared. And we're shown, more Legionnaires in 30th century Earth. It's Mon-El and Element Lad. All while one man watches. And then we see the character, the Monitor, standing in front of three more monitors, which left to right are Killer Frost and Firestorm, The Great Disaster, Batman, Nightwing, Cole, Metamorpho, and Jericho, outsiders and Teen Titans in the 20th century. And then on the left, it's Shadow Demons over 1940s Markovia. And the monitor is brooding and saying, he's moved. He's in italics. He's moved quicker than I expected. Another vertical column of very slender panels in the middle. Instead of days, only hours remain. The Earths are doomed. Still, my machines are in place. My agents are at their posts. It is time for my plan to begin. And then a voice comes from off-panel as the monitor opens his mouth agape a bit and turns to react. Wrong, old fool. And then the final panel, full-body shot of Harbinger, her pulsing with power, her eyes completely blackened. She says, it is time for you to die. So the Harbinger's betrayal of the monitor when she turns Judas has finally come. And the next issue blurb, this is the big one, the end of the multiverse, when worlds die. And there the issue ends.
One correction. You might have just said it out of turn. You said Firestorm and Killer Frost were in the Great Disaster. They're actually that's a tease for next issue when they're in Earth 2's Camelot time. Where are they? I forget.
I also forget. But have we even seen them yet? Is that why I'm misremembering where they were sent?
Right. Yeah, we haven't seen them yet. We'll see them next issue. So you said Great Disaster, but Firestorm and Killer Frost are we see them next issue. They were sent with Shining. No, they were sent with.
I think it's just the two of them, but they meet the Shining Knight of that era. From before he was frozen in ice and woke up in 1942 or whenever.
Right.
But you're right. It is. They are on Earth 2, and it is during the time of Camelot. It's issue 4, page 12.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, you just said Great Disaster, so I wanted to make sure listeners didn't.
Thank you for the correction.
Mess it up. Yeah. Where are my notes? He says my agents are at their posts to do what? We have no idea. I love that this is Monitor watching people on monitors while being monitored by Harbinger on a monitor. That's amazing. And if you don't know what I mean, there could be some confusion. Is she really there? In that bottom middle panel, it kind of looks like Monitor's reacting to her saying "wrong, old fool." But if you look at the first vertical panel, all the way down at the bottom, the corners are squared off. The middle set of panels are rounded again, and then the third panel is squared off. So there could be some confusion, what's going on. But as we'll see next issue, she is watching him on a monitor. And that's why she says what she says. So it's a way to get a cliffhanger, but it doesn't actually pay off right away next issue.
Yeah, I did not pick up on that. Because I really should have, because we do get a lot of – the Monitor is clearly still alive and doing stuff, unaccosted by Harbinger in issue 4. Wow.
Yeah. And part of me thinks, is it a happy coincidence that those middle panels, is it that calculated that they really do know at this point that she's watching, or was it just a happy accident? But I've read in a couple places here and there that people were confused by that sequence. Such as,
Yeah, I guess I was one of them, but yes, you are right. As issue number 4 begins, Harbinger is not in the same room with Monitor.
Right.
She doesn't actually come to confront him until almost all the way to the end of issue 4. And at that point, Pariah is actually in the room with him.
Yeah. Right, yeah, right. And I do love that image of Harbinger. It's almost Dark Phoenix-esque.
Oh, yeah, good call.
Yeah, I think it's a great shot of her. It's one of those images that kind of stands out when I think of the Crisis itself. I could sort of flip through the pages in my mind's eye and go, oh yeah, the end of issue 3. And that's it. That's all I really have for that page.
One more quick note.
Yep.
The second Monitor, the one that focuses in on the Old West, notice the juxtaposition of the phrase "on every Earth" with the Old West. So again, we're left to wonder, do these DC costumed Western characters exist on Earth 1 or Earth 2? I'm still inclined to say Earth 1 because otherwise we'd have 2 Johnny Thunders on the same Earth, and that just can't happen.
Yeah, and we haven't really touched on Earth 2 yet. I mean, we will next issue, but I mean...
Right, when we find that there is 1 vibratory tower on Earth 2 and the rest are apparently on Earth 1.
Yeah. That's just wrong. But I mean, even to the fact that we don't... I mean, the dialogue next issue will even say these 2 Earths are in peril, Up till now, we don't know that. It's been sort of Earth 1 centric, so...
Well, I guess it's not impossible, too, that maybe one of the other towers could be on Earth 2. Maybe the Old West one, maybe DM Hate argued that the Earth 2 era one with in Markovia with Sergeant Rock and the Haunted Tank might actually be on Earth 2, which would explain the All-Star comment that we were talking about. Maybe even, for all we know, maybe Commandy's reality was the future of Earth 2. And maybe when Superman went to that future to visit with him in DC Comics Presents, he went across universal boundaries as well.
Or you could sort of say, how far back does Earth 2's history go in relation to their characters? So they don't need a World War II fork because they're present. The strongest version of their Earth is World War II. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess you could say Vigilante does kind of represent their Earth, their Wild West, but how far back does Atlantis go? Or do they even have it? Yeah, I guess they have an Aquaman, but you know what I mean? Like, how far back?
Well, yeah, their Aquaman isn't Atlantean, though. He was the son of a scientist who mutated him.
Yeah, so if you look at all their characters, you have to sort of say, okay, of all their characters on Earth 2 that Roy Thomas has put on Earth 2 or whatever, how far back do any of their histories go? And if Camelot because of Shining Knight, I guess, maybe, maybe that's why the fork is there, because prior to that, there is nothing that affects any of their heroes, in World War II.
Well,
none of their origin. But I mean,
go back
I'm
to the
totally just speaking out.
I'm thinking of Vandal Savage all of a sudden here.
Right, but he is, and that's true. But he does show up in Camelot. So
right,
yeah. And his origin on Earth 2 is the same. He's a Neanderthal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or Cro-Magnon or whatever. No, Neanderthal, yeah. Yeah.
Although the funny thing is, the Immortal Man is given as his antagonist, and the two of them supposedly shared an origin, except they were on two different Earths.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, boy.
Yeah, see, you don't know.
Digging up all kinds of dirt here.
I think Wolfman could have spared at least one more. Did we really have to go back to Atlantis? I mean, we were there already when we picked up Arion. We probably could have saved that for an Earth 2.
Yeah. Oh, then again, maybe Arion's Atlantis is a part of the Earth 2.
No, I deny that comment.
Yeah, Roy Thomas was writing it.
Was writing what?
Arion.
He was?
I thought he was. Am I thinking of something
He
else?
wrote Arak, Son of Thunder.
Who was writing Arion then?
Paul Kupperberg, I believe.
Oh.
I am looking it up as we speak. I'll just pick some random issues in the thing.
I'm doing the same thing.
Paul Kupperberg. Yeah, first issue, middle issue, and last issue are all Paul Kupperberg.
All right, that is entirely my mistake then.
Yeah.
But yeah, I probably was thinking of Arak, Son of Thunder.
Yeah. Okay, you said you wanted to say something about the text page.
Right, because this is issue number 3 of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and there was eventually going to be a letters column, and we'll be dipping into that in future episodes, of course. But they didn't quite get enough letters together by press time for the publication deadline for this issue. So instead, for the Crisis mail page, we got an essay, which Marv Wolfman entitled Cooperation DC Style, and it is indeed written by the writer and editor of the Crisis maxi series, Wolfman himself. Welcome to the 3rd issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC Comics 12-part maxi series that will, by the time we're done, streamline the entire DC multiverse into one coherent universe with a coherent past, present, and future. So there it is, your topic sentence. He's just verifying for us that was, as far as he was concerned, as of that point in the project, what the major aim of the maxi series was to be. We had intended on running your letters in this issue's Crisis mail, but the deadline is... that's not important. Despite this mistake, the mistake being that they were running a little late with the letter column, despite this mistake, coordination, italicized, is the key word for Crisis on Infinite Earths. When we first began work on Crisis, a flurry of memos scurried from my tiny broom closet of an office to the rest of the vast DC suite of offices. Associate editor Bob Greenberger and I needed help. Lots of it. Crisis could not be produced just by us. We needed the other DC editors and writers at our side. Did anyone want new costumes for their characters? Who wanted to tie into the Crisis in its early stages? Who had characters they would like to be introduced in the Crisis? And who had characters destined to, heaven forbid, perish in these pages? All concerned had to be informed about the Monitor so he could appear in our entire line, from the New Teen Titans to G.I. Combat, which, for those collectors out there who didn't know it, was the only DC comic to show what the Monitor looked like before his supposed first appearance here in the Crisis. More memos followed. Once the series began, how could individual books tie into the Crisis? We knew the Crisis would begin in July of 1985, even though the first issue of the series came out in January. We knew when the Crisis would be ending and how long the actual story took, so our other writers and editors had to take that information and make their own decisions on how and when they would participate. As I mentioned in my first letters page, DC is not a company where one editor rules supreme. We have slightly more than a half-dozen editors who work pretty much independently with one eye on their titles and the other eye on the rest of the line. There is no house style at DC, no form imposed on everyone, no method of working that everyone must follow. I'm not sure that's still true today, but that's neither here nor there. However, the Crisis was going to affect all DC characters, and therefore all editors needed to work together, but the method of their participation was left pretty much up to them. Yes, you'll see the beginning of natural disasters echoing throughout the entire DC line late this summer and into the fall. You'll see cosmic disturbances and unexplained phenomena, but some DC books will use the Crisis as a starting point for their own adventures, while others will simply acknowledge the Crisis happenings and move on to tell their own tales. Hence the infamous Red Sky crossovers that we saw in some bannered Crisis tie-ins throughout that summer. However, all DC comics are being affected by the Crisis, and the results, which you will see in December of this year, will change DC for all time to come. Editors and writers corral me in the DC hallways with ideas they have to tie in with the Crisis, and perhaps that is one of the most gratifying parts of this assignment. Cooperation was slow at first because most everyone fears change, but as most of the editors realized they could use the Crisis to streamline their own books to improve their titles, or perhaps to call attention to changes they could be proud of, they began working up many ideas of their own. During this year, you'll see many ingenious ways of tying in with this series, including several double-sized specials of the most unlikely kind. The first is a giant Losers special appearing this summer that will pick up on the events seen in this issue. You'll also see crossovers from Superman to The Flash, Swamp Thing, Blue Devil, The Teen Titans, and many, many other books. We're cooperating here to make the 1980s the DC decade, and we hope you will cooperate with us and let us know what you think of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And the bottom of the page is then taken up with a couple of early character sketches of Perez's, showing Harbinger from a couple of different angles and also a close-up of her head. So there you go. Coordination is the key word, Wolfman tells us. And I think they may have kind of lost their grasp on their keyword as we get to the later issues and later months of the series, later issues of the series itself, and some of the tie-ins that occurred concurrent with those. But yeah, coordination was their ideal, and it may have been a little more than they could actually maintain as the project just kept growing and growing.
It's interesting that you sort of commented all that, and because that's kind of leading into my fun fact a little bit. So, but I don't want to jump on if you have any other thoughts on that letter page.
Well, he's talking about how all the different writers and editors were kind of slow to adapt to what's happening here, but eventually got on board, whether they actually wanted to or not. Wolfman says that they saw ways that it was in their best interest to coordinate and cooperate. I'm sure that quite a few of them were dragged along with this kicking and screaming. And it's, again, I always say this about Roy Thomas, but you really have to give him tons of credit for being a good sport, because the books he was writing and editing were more affected than any others at DC, arguably, by what Crisis did. It pulled the whole Earth 2 concept out of his clutching fingers. And yet he was as rah-rah as anybody as far as making suggestions and participating actively and in the Crisis as it went on. I mean, his books, All-Star Squadron and Infinity Inc., together had more Crisis crossovers. Actually, I think either one of them. I think they're the number 1 and 2 crossed over series with Crisis out of the entire DC line during all of this. So he at least was taking this mantra of coordination and cooperation to heart. And then he mentioned, Wolfman mentioned several double-sized specials. I can't offhand think of any Crisis tie-in specials other than the Losers special. But Peter, are there any you can think of that I'm not remembering?
No, I mean, I guess you could say sort of like the annuals, like the Justice League annual, the Infinity Inc. annual.
I think All-Star Squadron number 50 was double-sized.
Yeah, but outside of a special, the Last Days of the Justice Society, but that feels more like an afterthought more than anything.
Yeah, that's a postlude.
Yeah. So, no, Loser seems like the only one. So that could just be, editor speak.
Either that or they just had other things planned that didn't quite come to fruition.
Yeah. Or maybe he was even talking about the whole, what they, at this point, thought the last two issues were going to be, the whole history of the DC Universe thing. So, one thing, I'll throw my fun fact in here because it kind of speaks to all of this.
Go right ahead.
The fluidity of this series, how much they kind of had to, ebb and flow with the changes of whether changes coming from other creators, changes coming from administration, or, even you could even say the bean counters, maybe there was some input up there, oh my God, we need more deaths. We need blah, blah, whatever. This is from Amazing Heroes number 66. Do you remember Amazing Heroes, the magazine from the 80s?
Well, I know of it, and thanks to Dr. Eamon Clark over in the UK, I have at least one issue of it in my possession. But yeah, I can't say I remember it firsthand, since I think it had already ceased publication by the time I started collecting. But yeah, I'm aware of it.
Okay, it's a treasure trove of information. I mean, it really is. When CGS was doing Comics Now, it's one of the magazines that I felt it could be sort of like a spiritual successor to, because it's so fascinating of a read. And when you flip through it, there are just some really great articles, and it was kind of like, dare I say, it was kind of like the mainstream comics journal. Because while it had a format, it wasn't like Wizard. It wasn't like Wizard in its sort of, I don't know, lowbrow approach, right. I guess you could say.
It wasn't just a fan rag.
Yeah. You'll say it.
Yeah, I had a subscription to it for enough years. I think I've earned it.
Yeah. I mean, it was a fan rag, but it was a fan rag with a lot of heart,
Yeah.
And
it was more classy and more substantive.
Right. And they weren't afraid to give bad reviews and have some really great interviews and some fantastic covers, and there's quite a number of Perez covers and two that are crisis oriented. So this comes to me by way of Mr. Phil, who I have the entire Amazing Heroes digitally. Probably not on the up and up, but that's okay. So it's a great reference material. And as I said, this is All-Star. This is Amazing Heroes number 66. It is the Crisis issue. It's a look at the secrets behind DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths. So it came out March of 1985. And the issues that the article I'm referring to was written by Mark Waid. And it's called Beginnings and Endings. And he interviews a whole bunch of people about, the crisis. And at the time, issue 3 was already released, and they were probably working on at least up to issue 5, if not 6 by this point. So my fun fact is not necessarily sort of like a specific fact, but it speaks more to the creation of Crisis, on the ongoing creation of this huge 12-issue maxi series, and how they had to punt every now and then. So Wolfman is saying, okay, here I wrote these. At one point he says, I wrote these stories that every 4 issues was going to be its own sort of unit.
Okay, so my observation that it can be split up into 4-issue movements was kind of on target, in spite of myself.
I'm trying to find that direct passage, but let me see. Hold on. Let me see. Sorry, folks. I'll get there. Crap. I can't find it because that's not what I was going to focus on. But he did say that. He said, if you notice at the end of issue 4, if you notice at the end of issue 8, the series kind of has a little bit of a, breathing point, but it's still all connected once you get to the next issue beyond that. So anyway, so he starts detailing about, here's what's going to happen in issues 5 through 8. Here's what's going to happen in issue 7. He says issue 7 will be the big origin issue, explaining the Monitor, Harbinger, Lila, Pariah, and the origin of the DC universe. Issue 7 will have the biggest calamity to occur in Crisis. One of DC's main characters will go away forever. The second very big one will be going away in number 8. What was funny about that comment is I was looking through later Amazing Heroes issues, and around the time of Crisis number 5, they were already having ads for issue number 7 with the cover of Superman holding Supergirl. So clearly, again, that was not a secret. It was certainly not a secret to me anyway, and to a lot of people. So, let's see. He talks about the new characters, Harbinger, Pariah, etc., etc. And he says here, let's see. My hope is that he, meaning Pariah, and maybe Harbinger, will survive all of this. But since the last 2 issues have yet to be fully plotted, it remains to be seen. So I thought that was kind of interesting that 2 of what I sort of consider the main character that we talked about, right? Pariah, Monitor, Harbinger, Lady Quark, the new Dr. Light, they sort of, Alexander Luthor, they seem like they are the major characters in the Crisis. And yet there was a point where even he did not know in the middle of writing it whether they were going to survive or not.
Well, they were they were ad hoc characters after all. He created them out of convenience and necessity.
Yeah.
So deciding what to do with them afterwards is kind of like buying new tools for a certain job. And I mean, do you think about where you're going to store a new tool that you've just bought to go home and fix your porch or whatever? When you're coming home from the hardware store, or you just concentrate on what you're going to do with the tools as far as the job at hand.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised he hadn't quite figured out what would happen with those characters yet. He was too busy thinking about the characters who had brighter futures as monetarily viable stars of series for DC.
Yeah. And look, maybe you could make the argument that, like an editor, Dick Giordano or somebody, can make the argument, oh no, we can't use them because if we want everybody to forget about the Crisis, we can't have the Crisis characters involved in post-Crisis DC.
Mm-hmm. Yep, which another little mind warp there. It would be easy enough just to come up with a way to kill them all off at the last minute, but I'm kind of glad that he arrived at a different solution.
Yeah. I mean, he even says here, I haven't worked out Pariah's powers fully yet, only because he won't be that essential to the final outcome. I was like, what? Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of true. It kind of is true.
Well, yeah, he really wasn't that essential to the story as a whole when you sit right down and think about it. He was there as part of his role was really more symbolic than it was active in the story. Mm-hmm. He was just there for atmosphere, for mythological resonance,
Yeah. And then the other thing I thought was really kind of strange, and I'm kind of glad that fanzines weren't easily accessible back then, and certainly not the internet. So again, as I said, this issue came out. Issue 3 was out. Maybe issue 4 might have been out by the time you got your hands on this issue. But he flat out, there's a quote here that says, the real conflict comes when we discover who and what is behind all of this. A lot of it has to do with the Guardians of the Universe. a lot of it has to do with the antimatter universe of Quard. And he even flat out says at one other point that the antimatter is coming from Quard. And I thought that was a little sort of I was like, whoa, wait a minute. That's kind of a gimme there. It's a little bit of a spoiler there.
A little bit, yeah. Of course, he didn't reveal the identity of the big heavy of the story, the big bad.
No.
So,
And it's not. And again, like I think I mentioned this last issue. You know, had I been a little bit older and my trivia, my speculative powers been a little bit more, you know, honed, maybe I would have thought, oh, sure, yeah. Monitor, positive matter, antimatter, it's got to be something with Quard, you know what I mean? Or the antimatter universe, you know.
And so we see Sinestro as like the main bad guy, for example.
Right, exactly. Oh, here's the other one. The other quote. Our heroes and villains brought together by the Monitor have been assembled and charged with the responsibility of defeating the wave of antimatter energy from the Quard universe. I was like, what? You're not telling us that in the issues. That's not something we find out till later, you know. So I thought that was it's so sort of nonchalant about it in the interview.
So what we keep saying about how in the 1985 we didn't have the internet and it was so much harder to be spoiled about these things, we didn't learn them until we go to the newsstand and pick up the issue itself. It's maybe not entirely true.
Not entirely true, yeah. I mean, there's here's one precedent anyway. So fanzines, you know, even back then.
Yep, spoilers were still laying in wait even back then.
Yeah. I mean, the only other fanzine there was Comics Scene at this point. There was Comics Interview. I remember that was out. I'm trying to think of what else. Oh, I guess CBG was out during this time, Comics Buyer's Guide. So I just thought that was fun, kind of, you know, digging into Marv Wolfman's brain as he was writing it. It's always kind of fun to see the process and to know that the fates of the big Crisis characters were, you know, not so safe. So that's my Crisis fun fact.
Oh, cool. Yeah, you know, I'll have to go home and read my issue of Amazing Heroes now. See if it turns out to be the same one. Oh,
cool. Yeah. There's also a one that happens after the Crisis, an issue that happens after the Crisis where they do sort of like a wrap up and they talk about all the dead heroes and you know, a whole bunch of other stuff. So that's a good one to have too. So you have to let me know what issue number and then I'll let you know. It's either 66 is the pre one and 91 is the post one.
Okay, got it. My memory for numbers is not the strongest, but I think I can hold those two until I get home. And then I can tell you what I find out when I see you on Saturday.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Wild Pig.
Wild Pig.
I'm sure this episode will come out after we've already been there, but yeah, we're going to Wild Pig. Free comic book day.
Mr. Phil's going to be there, the aforementioned Mr. Phil.
Yep.
Brian Pants Christman will be there, who's definitely not in this room right now.
Which means that he is.
Laughing at his hand over there.
Well, I saw him test out the Periscope thing on Twitter. I didn't actually see the thing, but I saw that he posted. So now we're talking completely out of turn, but that's okay. One more thing. Sorry, this totally relates to what you just said in the text page. Marv Wolfman saying about people, getting people to help out and all that, right? Hold on, I need to get it back up again. That's what she said.
Is this something else from Amazing Heroes or from another source?
No, from the same place. Same article. This is a quote from Bob Greenberger.
Associate editor of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Right.
He says, people had to, let's see. For example, an Earth being affected by the crisis does all kinds of nasty things to ecology. We were talking about red skies, earthquakes. Julie Schwartz is taking it a step further in Superman and is talking about things like a realignment of the constellations, clocks running backwards, compasses no longer working. We're working very closely with all the editors in that way. Everybody wants to kibitz. Even the people who sit there and grouse end up wittingly or unwittingly contributing. which I thought that was a funny comment. And then he says, you'll like this. He says, aside from me, Len, and Marv, there's been one other person who has been a fountain of suggestions. Who do you think he's going to say?
I'm going to think he's going to say Roy Thomas.
No, he says, and that's Dan Mishkin.
The Blue Devil guy. Hey.
And the Bowling Green guy, right?
Yeah, right. My fellow product of the Bowling Green pop culture department.
That's right. He says, even though he's in Michigan, he's in phone contact. We just got a several-page memo regarding Amethyst's role in the crisis. A couple of weeks before, we had finished hammering out this wonderful, wacky crossover starting in Blue Devil, going into Crisis, and ending up in Omega Men. We're talking about a lot of fun and a lot of help. I single him out because he's been the most prolific, but everyone has been very, 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 very helpful all along the way. He does say, in addition to the Blue Devil, Omega Man Adventure, DC is planning a number of one-shot specials tying in with the Crisis. For instance, according to Greenberger, in issue 3, we have a variety of characters running around Markovia for 4 to 5 pages. We wanted to expand upon that. So based on some suggestions Marv and I made, Dick Giordano assigned Bob Kanigher a 40-page loser special. We're also here's an answer to your question. We're also talking to editor Andy Helfer and writer Steve Englehart about possibly doing a special issue of Green Lantern that would be Crisis related and would play off some changes in the structure of the Green Lantern Corps. Now, I think that eventually became issue 200.
Right,
but
and a few issues leading up to that, too.
Yeah, he says, I've been pushing Helfer to do some Tales of the Green Lantern Corps stories that play off the Crisis because we don't have books that can truly show the cosmic scope of the problem. So there you go. There's a whole bunch of stuff that relates to that text page you just read and to issue 3, which we just covered, and we get a fun Dan Mishkin thing in there. And apparently to Bob Greenberger, he said that he's done a lot. Which, I don't know. Maybe that's a dig at Roy Thomas, but I don't know.
It comes a little bit of a surprise, too, but I'm happy to know that Blue Devil and Amethyst co-creator Dan Mishkin was that much on board.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah. And eventually we did get an Amethyst crossover featuring Dr. Fate. One of the later ones, as I recall.
Yeah, she was definitely affected by the Crisis. Her whole origin was basically revamped.
Right.
So the Blue Devil thing, Omega Man, not so much.
Yeah, it wasn't important or impactful, but it was fun.
Yeah.
It was one of the few Crisis crossovers that actually got its own little asterisked cross-reference caption within the series itself.
Well, there you go.
Yep, there you go. 3 hours and change of Crisis talk, about half of one issue. Oh, we can talk, can't we?
Yes, we can.
All right, well, I guess it's time to put this one to bed. Right, so we're going to close here by encouraging everyone to visit thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com to enter your feedback about this episode, your thoughts about the second half of issue number 3, your own ideas for what Kid Psycho Secret Identity anagramizes to. Also, if you have any Crisis Kid stories of your own you'd like to share from your experiences in the mid-'80s, please do share them. We may very well read them aloud on the air in some future time. So, thanks for listening and reading along with us as we continue to dig into this epical and amazingly interesting story from DC Comics' past. And we'll see you on the other side of that great white wall.